A teenage bedroom is supposed to be a sanctuary, but on a freezing November morning in 2016, that illusion was shattered forever. A 16-year-old girl lay fast asleep in her bed, her family resting just down the hall. There was no forced entry, no broken locks, no footsteps creeping up the stairs. Just a 9mm bullet ripping through an exterior wooden wall, finding its target in the pitch black with terrifying precision. A safe suburban home transformed into an execution chamber in a fraction of a second. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Knoxville, in Tennessee, sits tucked within the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains, a sprawling city that still manages to hold on to a tightly knit, small-town atmosphere. In the affluent, quiet subdivisions of the area, life revolves around Friday night football games, school spirit, and tight family bonds. This was the world of 16-year-old Emma Jane Walker. Born in 2000, Emma was the kind of teenager who naturally drew people into her orbit. She possessed a radiant, almost kinetic energy. With her bright blonde hair and constant smile, she fit the archetype of the popular American cheerleader. But those who knew her understood she was far more than a high school cliché. Emma was fiercely determined, possessing a sharp mind and a deeply empathetic core. She spent her weekends volunteering at local animal shelters, driven by a lifelong ambition to become a neonatal nurse. She wanted to spend her life caring for premature infants, a testament to her nurturing spirit and her desire to protect the most vulnerable. Her parents, Mark and Jill Walker, provided a stable, loving environment. They raised Emma and her older brother with a focus on respect, boundaries, and hard work. Emma was an honors student at Central High School, managing to balance the demanding schedule of competitive cheerleading with rigorous academic classes. Her bedroom was a reflection of her vibrant personality, walls covered in photographs of friends, cheer ribbons, and mementos of a happy, sheltered adolescence. To the outside observer, Emma's life was a picture of suburban perfection. She was moving steadily toward a bright, meticulously planned future. She had the grades, the ambition, and the unyielding support of a family who adored her. In the fall of 2014, when Emma was a high school freshman, she crossed paths with a junior named William Riley Gall. Riley, who went by his middle name, was exactly the kind of boy who easily captured attention in a southern high school. He was 18, broad-shouldered, and a wide receiver for the Central High School Bobcats football team. Riley was polite, soft-spoken, and well-liked by his peers and coaches. He came from a religious family, regularly attended church, and seemed to embody the ideal student-athlete. To a 14-year-old freshman, the attention of an older, popular varsity football player was incredibly flattering. The initial stages of their interaction were entirely normal, exchanging messages, talking in the hallways between classes, and spending time together at school events. By all outward appearances, Emma and Riley were the quintessential high school power couple, the cheerleader and the football player. They began officially dating, and their relationship quickly became the center of both their lives. Riley appeared incredibly devoted, attending all of Emma's cheer competitions, bringing her gifts, and constantly expressing his affection. At first, this level of attention felt validating. It felt like love. But beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic teenage romance, a subtle shift was beginning to occur. Riley's devotion was not rooted in mutual respect, but in an intense, creeping need for possession. While Emma was looking for a partner to share her vibrant life with, Riley was looking for someone to completely consume. He was masking a deep-seated insecurity and a volatile temperament behind his quiet, polite exterior. As an athlete, he was accustomed to having control on the field, and he slowly began applying that same demand for control to his relationship with Emma. The transition from a caring boyfriend to a suffocating presence did not happen overnight. It was a gradual tightening of the grip, a slow erosion of Emma's independence disguised as romantic concern. At first, the dynamic between the two teenagers mirrored the classic high school narrative: bright, highly visible, and heavily documented on social media. They attended dances together, sat together in the bleachers, and appeared inseparable. But this outward projection of a perfect romance was a carefully constructed facade, one that Riley meticulously maintained while quietly dismantling Emma's autonomy behind closed doors. The transition from a doting partner to a suffocating captor did not happen in a single, explosive moment. Instead, it was an insidious, methodical process of isolation. It began with a digital leash. Riley demanded constant communication, requiring immediate responses to his text messages, regardless of where Emma was or what she was doing. A missed call or a delayed reply would result in a barrage of accusations. He insisted on having the passwords to her social media accounts, monitoring her private conversations under the guise of absolute transparency. He would scroll through her phone, dissecting her interactions with classmates, searching for any perceived slight or threat to his absolute authority over her attention. If she spoke to another male student, even just a casual greeting in the hallway, Riley would interrogate her, his jealousy flaring into quiet, intense anger. This need for control quickly bled into the physical world. He began dictating her wardrobe, expressing extreme displeasure if he deemed a dress too short or a cheerleading uniform too revealing. He pressured her to change her clothes, manipulating her by claiming that his demands were rooted in respect and protection. Emma, initially mistaking this possessiveness for fierce loyalty, tried to accommodate him. She altered her behavior, attempting to shrink herself to fit the narrow, rigid mold he was constructing for her. But Emma was inherently strong-willed. As the months bled into years, the claustrophobia of the relationship became impossible to ignore. The constant surveillance and baseless accusations sparked intense, exhausting arguments. The cycle became entirely predictable: a suffocating demand, a bitter fight, followed by Riley offering tearful apologies and extravagant promises to change. He would buy her gifts, write lengthy letters of devotion, and swear that his behavior was just a byproduct of how deeply he cared for her. Those closest to the couple began to notice the dark undercurrents. Emma's friends saw her radiant energy dimming. The girl who was once the center of every social gathering was now frequently anxious, constantly checking her phone, terrified of triggering another one of Riley's dark moods. Her parents, Mark and Jill, watched this toxic dynamic unfold with mounting dread. They recognized the classic red flags of emotional abuse and manipulation. They saw the toll it was taking on their daughter's mental health, the exhaustion behind her eyes, the sudden shifts in mood, the way she seemed to be constantly walking on eggshells in her own home. Mark and Jill stepped in, attempting to construct a protective barrier around their daughter. They implemented strict boundaries, banning Riley from their property and restricting Emma's ability to see him outside of school hours. At times, they even confiscated her phone, taking the blame upon themselves just to give their daughter a few hours of peace away from Riley's relentless digital bombardment. By the fall of 2016, Emma had reached her absolute limit. She was a high school junior now, focused on her future, her grades, and her friends. She realized that the relationship was a sinking ship, and she finally found the resolve to cut the anchor. She officially ended the relationship, telling Riley with absolute clarity that it was over and that she wanted nothing more to do with him. For a normal teenager, a breakup is a painful but necessary rite of passage. For Riley, it was an unacceptable loss of control. He refused to process the rejection. He simply decided that the breakup was not real, that Emma was just confused, and that he could force her back into submission. His behavior rapidly deteriorated from toxic boyfriend to relentless stalker. When Emma blocked his phone number, he used apps to generate fake numbers, bombarding her with hundreds of messages a day. When she ignored those, he weaponized guilt. He began threatening self-harm, sending dark, manipulative messages suggesting that he could not survive without her. He would wait outside her workplace, park his car near her neighborhood, and find ways to constantly insert himself into her physical space. Emma was no longer dating Riley, but she was entirely trapped by him. The high school romance had died, leaving behind a volatile, obsessed young man who was willing to go to terrifying lengths to prove that if he could not have her, no one else would. By mid-November 2016, the temperature in East Tennessee had plummeted into the freezing 30s, and a different kind of chill was settling over Emma's life. Riley was finally realizing that the relentless digital bombardment and emotional manipulation were no longer working. The breakup was sticking. Deprived of his control, his obsession mutated into something far more dangerous, a manufactured reality. If he could not win her back through guilt, he would try to win her back through fear. He needed to create a scenario where Emma was in absolute peril, a crisis that only he could solve. He was shifting from the rejected boyfriend to a fabricated savior. The psychological terror began a few days before the Thanksgiving break. Emma's phone vibrated with a series of text messages from an unknown, untraceable number. The sender claimed to have kidnapped Riley. The digital voice was threatening, ordering the 16-year-old girl to follow their instructions if she ever wanted to see her ex-boyfriend alive again. The anonymous sender demanded that she step outside her house alone. Instead of complying with the terrifying directive, Emma immediately contacted mutual friends, asking them to check on Riley's whereabouts. They found him perfectly safe, lounging in his college dorm room. It did not take a seasoned detective to deduce the origin of those messages. The clumsily executed threat was Riley's first attempt at a false flag operation, a desperate bid to force Emma to engage with him. But the theatrics were about to escalate from a digital nuisance into a physical nightmare. Friday, November 18th, Emma was at home alone. Her parents were out for the evening, leaving her in the quiet suburban house. Shortly before midnight, the silence was shattered. Heavy, violent pounding echoed from the front door. It was not a casual knock, but the aggressive thumping of someone trying to force the wood to splinter. Emma crept toward the entryway, her heart hammering against her ribs, and peered through the window. Standing on her porch was a tall figure dressed entirely in black, his face completely obscured by a dark hood. The figure aggressively rattled the heavy brass doorknob, checking the locks. Emma backed away, enveloped in a wave of cold panic. She locked herself inside her bedroom and frantically began messaging anyone who was awake, pleading for help. In a calculated twist of timing, Riley just happened to be in the neighborhood. He arrived at the property with suspicious speed. Riley messaged her, claiming he had bravely chased the dark-clad prowler into the nearby woods. He stood outside her house, adopting the role of the protective hero, waiting for her to open the door and fall into his arms. But Emma remained locked inside. When her mother, Jill, returned home shortly after, she found Riley loitering on the front lawn. The police were immediately dispatched to the residence. When responding officers questioned the college student, they noted his calm demeanor. He showed zero signs of physical exertion, no heavy breathing, no mud on his shoes, no adrenaline shakes that would accompany a foot chase through the brush in the pitch black. Recognizing his presence as a gross violation of their established boundaries, Jill ordered Riley off the property. The hero had failed to gain entry. Saturday, November 19th, less than 24 hours later, Riley amplified his staged drama. This time, he cast himself as the absolute victim. Early that morning, his college roommates reported him missing. They told campus security that they could not find him and that he had left his vehicle behind. Panic rippled through their social circles until later that afternoon, when a passerby spotted Riley wandering aimlessly along a desolate stretch of rural highway, miles from his campus. He was found near a shallow drainage ditch, looking disoriented. When sheriff's deputies arrived to investigate, Riley delivered an incredibly detailed yet deeply flawed narrative. He informed the officers that he had been ambushed at his car by unknown men, forcefully dragged into a mysterious van, and driven to an undisclosed location. The detectives listened patiently, but the cracks in his story were gaping. Despite claiming he had been abducted and dumped in the wild, Riley's clothes were impeccably clean. He had no defensive wounds, no bruises, and no scratches. The heavy scent of damp autumn leaves clung to the air, yet his shoes were dry. When pressed for descriptions of the kidnappers or the van, his memory conveniently dissolved into vague generalities. The authorities recognized it for what it was, a monumental waste of police resources and a glaring red herring. When Emma was informed of the supposed kidnapping, she felt no sympathy. The accumulation of the anonymous texts, the figure in the black hood, and now the bizarre roadside abduction crystallized into one undeniable truth. She confided in her closest friends that she believed Riley was faking the entire sequence of events just to manipulate her emotions and force her to talk to him. She firmly communicated through intermediaries that she saw right through his charade. The psychological grip was entirely broken. Riley's desperate staged attempts to play the rescuer had not only failed, but they had also alienated her completely. Stripped of his manipulative tools and facing absolute rejection, his manufactured crises evaporated. The theater was closing. What remained was a seething, volatile obsession, and a final chilling realization that if the role of the savior was no longer available to him, he would assume the role of the executioner. The weekend drew to a close, and a biting chill settled over Knoxville. By the early hours of Monday, November 21st, 2016, temperatures had plummeted into the low 30s Fahrenheit. Inside the Walker residence, the atmosphere was finally peaceful. The exhausting theatrics of the previous days, the anonymous threats, the prowler in the black hood, the fabricated kidnapping, seemed to have entirely evaporated. Emma was exhausted. She had spent Sunday evening talking with friends, firmly reiterating that she was completely done with Riley Gall. Her boundaries were set. She went to her ground floor bedroom, changed into comfortable sleepwear, and climbed into bed. She fell asleep quickly. Her bed was positioned snugly into the corner of the room, pressed directly against the home's exterior wooden wall. The house went dark. The suburban street fell dead silent. Outside, the frost began to harden on the grass. Sometime in the pitch black of the early morning, a figure approached the side of the Walker home. There was no attempt to bypass the locks, no fumbling with the windows, no desire to look the victim in the eye. This was not a crime of passion committed in the heat of a screaming argument. It was a cold, calculated execution. The perpetrator stood in the freezing yard, staring at the blank exterior wall of Emma's bedroom. He knew the exact layout of the room. He knew exactly where the bed was positioned. He understood the height and the precise angle required. He raised a 9mm handgun in the dark. He aimed meticulously at the spot where a sleeping girl's head would be resting against the drywall. He pulled the trigger. The blast of the 9mm shattered the suburban silence. A fraction of a second later, a second shot rang out. The physics of the event were terrifyingly precise. The heavy copper-jacketed bullets ripped instantly through the vinyl siding, splintered the wooden frame, and punched through the interior drywall. One bullet missed, embedding itself harmlessly into the room. The other found its mark with horrifying accuracy. The projectile struck the 16-year-old girl just behind her left ear while she was fast asleep. There was no time to react, no time to register fear or pain. Emma Walker's life ended in a fraction of a second, her vibrant future extinguished in the dark sanctuary of her own bedroom. Outside, the shooter lowered the weapon. He turned and vanished back into the freezing night, leaving no physical trace on the lawn, slipping away before the neighborhood even fully registered the sharp cracks echoing through the streets. Inside the house, the gunshots had briefly roused Emma's mother, Jill. She stirred in her sleep, disoriented by the sudden, sharp noises. But in the hazy confusion of the early morning hours, she rationalized the sounds. She assumed a heavy door had slammed somewhere in the house, or perhaps a large piece of furniture had fallen. The house quickly descended back into absolute silence. Assuming her children were safely asleep in their beds, Jill closed her eyes and drifted back to sleep. A few hours later, the sun crept over the horizon, bleeding gray morning light into the neighborhood. It was around 6 a.m. The Walker house began to wake up for a standard Monday morning. Routines commenced. Jill noticed that Emma was not awake yet. Her daughter was usually reliable with her morning schedule, needing plenty of time to get ready for school and cheerleading practice. The mother walked down the hallway to Emma's ground floor bedroom. She opened the door. The room was quiet. Too quiet. Emma was lying in her bed, her back turned to the door, seemingly fast asleep. Jill stepped into the room and gently called her daughter's name. No response. She approached the bed and reached out, gently shaking Emma's leg to rouse her. The horrific reality of the moment shattered the morning. Her daughter's skin was freezing to the touch. The 16-year-old was completely unresponsive. Panic seizing her throat, Jill frantically looked around the room, trying to process the impossible. It was then she noticed the faint metallic scent hanging in the stagnant air, mixed with the dry, chalky smell of pulverized drywall. She saw the small, jagged holes punched through the wall, directly above the mattress. The mother's screams tore through the house. The frantic, agonizing 911 call was placed at 6:30 a.m., but there was absolutely nothing the paramedics could do. Emma was gone. First responders arriving at the property were met with a scene of absolute devastation. The paradox of the setting was chilling. There were cheerleading ribbons hanging on the walls, photographs of smiling teenagers pinned to corkboards, and the mundane clutter of a high school student's life, all juxtaposed against the grim reality of a homicide investigation. The detectives noted the trajectory of the bullet holes immediately. The angles told a story of absolute premeditation. The shooter hadn't just fired blindly at a house. They had mapped out a kill zone from the outside, utilizing the victim's predictable sleeping habits against her. The investigation had officially begun, and the Knoxville police were staring down a terrifying mystery. Who would stand in the freezing dark just to execute a teenage girl through the walls of her own home? The immediate aftermath of the shooting plunged the Knox County Sheriff's Office into a forensic puzzle. The suburban property was cordoned off with bright yellow crime scene tape, a stark, unnatural contrast to the manicured lawns and quiet driveways of the neighborhood. Detectives and crime scene technicians began meticulously dissecting the geometry of the execution. They started outside. The freezing grass yielded very little physical evidence. No deep boot prints, no dropped items, no signs of a struggle. However, lying in the frost just a few feet from the exterior wall were 2 spent 9mm shell casings. The investigators analyzed the entry points in the vinyl siding. By inserting trajectory rods into the bullet holes and using laser levels, they mapped the exact flight path of the projectiles. The results eliminated any lingering theories of a tragic accident. The initial dead ends mirrored the classic frustrations of suburban homicide investigations. Without forced entry, detectives first had to consider if the bullets were the result of a random drive-by shooting or celebratory gunfire that had gone horrifically wrong. But the laser mapping proved otherwise. The trajectory rods pointed slightly downward, indicating the shooter was standing intimately close to the house, holding the weapon at chest level and firing at a precise downward angle right into the corner where the bed was located. It was not a stray bullet, it was a targeted assassination. The perpetrator knew the layout of the home, understood exactly where the victim slept, and possessed the chilling composure to execute the plan in the dark. As the sun fully rose, the social echo of the tragedy began to reverberate through Knoxville. News of the sudden death spread rapidly through the halls of Central High School. An empty desk in a morning class quickly transformed into a wave of panic. Administrators made a somber announcement, and grief counselors were immediately dispatched. But beneath the profound sorrow lay an undercurrent of absolute terror. The community was paralyzed by the idea that a random sniper was targeting teenagers in their beds. Parents rushed to lock their doors, cancel extracurricular activities, and pull their children out of school. The rumor mill churned with theories of gang initiations or a local prowler, feeding a collective paranoia. The town needed answers, and the pressure on law enforcement was immense. While the community panicked, the detectives began systematically clearing the victim's inner circle. They needed to interview family, friends, and naturally, the ex-boyfriend. The investigators were already aware of the volatile history between the two teenagers. The mother had informed the responding officers about the suffocating relationship, the recent breakup, and the bizarre theatrical events of the preceding weekend. The anonymous threatening texts, the man in black banging on the door, and the highly publicized, fabricated kidnapping. To the seasoned homicide detectives, these were glaring red flags. The staged events painted a psychological profile of an individual desperately losing control and attempting to manipulate his way back into a position of power. But as the police built their timeline, the prime suspect was busy constructing his own alibi in the public eye. Riley Gall took to social media to deliver a sickeningly elaborate performance of grief. He posted a lengthy tribute online, expressing his profound devastation. He wrote about how much he loved her, claiming that she was in a better place and that he would never forget the memories they shared. He composed a sprawling, multi-paragraph dedication to her beauty and her spirit, ending his digital monologue by stating that he loved her more than anything. This digital mourning was a calculated facade. It was an attempt to control the narrative, to position himself as the heartbroken survivor rather than the architect of the tragedy. He was weaponizing the community's sympathy. When detectives brought the college freshman into the interrogation room, they observed his demeanor closely. The young man sat before them, projecting an aura of quiet sorrow. Using a standard, non-confrontational approach, the investigators asked him to walk them through his weekend and his whereabouts on the night of the shooting. He told the detectives that he had been entirely heartbroken over the recent breakup, but was trying to move on. He claimed that on the night in question, he was safely in his college dorm room, fast asleep, completely unaware of the horror unfolding miles away. He feigned absolute shock when discussing her death, maintaining steady eye contact and offering polite, cooperative responses. He portrayed himself as a victim of circumstance, a grieving boy caught in a nightmare. The investigators listened patiently, documenting his alibi, without immediately revealing the cards they were holding. They knew his timeline was fragile, but to break a suspect who was this committed to his performance, they needed definitive physical evidence linking him to the 9mm casings found in the frozen grass. The midpoint pivot of the investigation arrived rapidly, delivered not by a crime lab, but by a separate police report filed over the weekend. While canvassing records, detectives discovered a report regarding a stolen firearm. The owner of the missing weapon was the suspect's own grandfather. He had reported to the police that his 9mm Glock pistol had been taken from his vehicle just days before the shooting. The theft had occurred during the exact same window of time when the suspect was frantically escalating his stalking behavior, right around the time of the fake kidnapping and the Prowler incident. The pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. The caliber of the stolen weapon matched the shell casings left at the crime scene. The detectives realized that the suspect hadn't just fabricated a kidnapping to gain sympathy. He had used the chaos of the weekend as a smokescreen to procure a murder weapon. The alibi was beginning to fracture. The grieving boyfriend act was collapsing under the weight of circumstantial evidence. But knowing someone is guilty and proving it in a court of law are two very different hurdles. The weapon was still missing. The suspect was sticking to his dorm room alibi. The police knew they had their man, but they needed the gun to secure a conviction. If he managed to dispose of the 9mm Glock before they could find it, the physical link tying him to the execution would vanish. The investigation shifted from a fact-finding mission into an active, high-stakes hunt for the firearm, and the detectives were about to get help from the most unlikely of sources. The breakthrough materialized from inside the suspect's own inner circle. Two college freshmen, Alex McCarty and Noah Walton, found themselves wrestling with a sickening realization. They had spent the previous days in close quarters with the supposedly grieving boyfriend, but his behavior behind closed doors blatantly contradicted his public mourning. He was highly agitated, pacing his dorm room and obsessing over forensic science. He eventually asked Alex how to completely wipe fingerprints from a textured metal surface. Even more damning, he confessed to possessing the missing firearm, spinning a frantic lie that he had taken it solely for personal protection against the imaginary kidnappers from the weekend. The two young men connected the dots. They realized their friend was not a traumatized survivor, but an active threat attempting to cover his tracks. In a display of profound moral courage, Alex and Noah made a terrifying choice. They walked straight into the Knox County Sheriff's Office. They informed the lead detectives that the suspect still had the stolen pistol and was actively plotting to throw it into the river. Investigators knew this was their only window of opportunity. If the weapon ended up at the bottom of the deep, fast-moving waterways of East Tennessee, the physical link tying the perpetrator to the execution would vanish forever. The detectives devised a high-stakes sting operation. They took the two college students into a secure room and equipped them with covert transmitters. Wires were taped flat against their chests. Tiny microphones were meticulously concealed beneath the thick fabric of their winter coats. The parameters of the plan were inherently dangerous. Two untrained teenagers were going to get into a confined, moving vehicle with a desperate, cornered individual who had already demonstrated a willingness to take a human life in cold blood. Night fell. The undercover operation commenced. Alex and Noah met up with the suspect at a pre-arranged location. They climbed into his vehicle. The air inside the small cabin was suffocatingly thick with unspoken tension. Hidden beneath their heavy coats, the transmitters hummed, relaying every agonizing second of audio to a fleet of unmarked police units trailing miles behind in the pitch black. The suspect navigated the vehicle through the dark, winding rural roads toward a desolate wooded bluff overlooking the Tennessee River. During the agonizingly slow drive, the hidden microphones captured exactly what the state needed. The suspect spoke with a chilling, detached calm. He instructed his friends on the exact mechanics of their mission, detailing how they were going to help him hurl the heavy object into the deepest part of the current. The audio feed revealed no tremor of grief. There was no sorrow for the girl whose life had been extinguished just 48 hours prior. There was only the cold, mechanical calculation of a predator trying to save himself. They reached the designated drop site. The vehicle's tires crunched to a halt over the frozen gravel. The suspect put the car in park. He reached down into the shadows beneath the passenger seat. He pulled out a black plastic trash bag. Inside the crinkling plastic rested the stolen pistol, a pair of dark gloves, and a heavy black hoodie. He grabbed the handle of the car door. He prepared to step out into the freezing air and walk toward the water's edge. He never made it to the riverbank. The absolute darkness of the gravel lot was instantly shattered. Blinding white floodlights ignited from every direction, illuminating the bare tree line with daylight intensity. The sudden, deafening roar of high-performance engines echoed off the bluffs as unmarked police cruisers surged forward, trapping the suspect's vehicle in a wall of steel. Heavily armed tactical officers swarmed the perimeter. Commands were barked through amplified bullhorns. The suspect froze. The calculated composure he had maintained for days evaporated in the blinding glare of the police lights. The black plastic bag slipped from his grasp. It hit the floorboards with a heavy, metallic thud. Officers pulled him from the driver's seat. He was forced face down onto the freezing asphalt. Steel handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists with a sharp, definitive click. The meticulously constructed theater of the heartbroken college athlete completely collapsed, leaving only the terrified reality of a captured fugitive. The weapon was secured without a single shot being fired. The sting operation had executed flawlessly, capturing the physical evidence necessary to ensure that the architect of this tragedy would never exert control over another human being again. The courtroom in Knox County offered no stage for theatrics. When the trial commenced, the defense attempted to spin a narrative of a tragic, unintended accident. They argued the defendant had merely intended to frighten his ex-girlfriend by firing into the dark house, hoping she would be terrified and run back to him for protection. A reckless stunt had gone horrifically wrong, but the physical evidence was insurmountable. Prosecutors methodically dismantled the accident theory. They presented the trajectory mapping to the jury, demonstrating how the weapon was held directly against the exterior vinyl siding and angled perfectly downward, aimed precisely at the corner where the victim was sleeping. It was a terrifying calculation, completely devoid of panic or error. The audio captured during the sting operation ultimately sealed his fate. The jury listened in absolute silence as the former athlete mechanically plotted to dispose of the stolen firearm, displaying zero remorse for the life he had extinguished just 48 hours prior. The facade of the heartbroken survivor was completely obliterated by his own recorded words. The jury deliberated briefly before returning their verdict, guilty on all charges, including first-degree murder. He received a mandatory life sentence, ensuring he would never again manipulate or exert authority over another human being. While the gavel strike offered legal resolution, it could not fill the permanent void left behind. The tragedy fundamentally altered the local community, stripping away the innocence of suburban adolescence. A vibrant, compassionate future was erased by an individual who believed that if he could not possess someone entirely, they simply could not exist. A final, grim reminder that extreme control is never a symptom of love. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. Conyers, Georgia, January 13th, 2010. A quiet subdivision is shattered by the hysterical cries of two 16-year-old girls. They had just returned from high school to find a scene of unimaginable carnage. Their mother, 34-year-old Nikki Whitehead, lay dead in a pool of blood on the master bathroom floor. The sheer brutality of the ambush suggested a crime of deep personal rage. Investigators immediately began searching for a deranged intruder. Failing to realize the true architects of this slaughter were the two weeping identical twins standing right in front of them. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Before the yellow police tape sealed off the residence, Nikki Whitehead was simply a woman striving for the American dream. Born in 1975, she was thrust into adulthood prematurely when she gave birth to identical twin girls, Jasmia and Tasmia, at just 18 years old. Navigating the world as a single teenage mother with two infants was a monumental challenge. Yet Nikki refused to let her circumstances dictate her future. She possessed an innate hustle and a sharp eye for aesthetics, qualities that naturally drew her to the beauty industry. Nikki built a highly reputable career as a cosmetologist and salon worker in the Atlanta area. The environment suited her vibrant, outgoing personality perfectly. Surrounded by the constant buzzing hum of blow dryers and the sharp chemical scent of acrylic nails and hairspray, she transformed her clients while simultaneously rebuilding her own life. Her ambition was singular and unwavering, to provide her daughters with a standard of living she had always toiled for. By her early 30s, that relentless work ethic finally materialized into tangible success. She secured a beautiful, sprawling home in the Bridal Ridge subdivision of Conyers, a quiet, affluent suburban community located roughly 24 miles east of downtown Atlanta. With its manicured lawns and expansive two-story houses, it was the exact type of neighborhood that signified safety and upward mobility. In their early years, the trio was entirely inseparable. Nikki, Jasmia, and Tasmia operated as a tightly knit, fiercely loyal unit. The girls were a living reflection of their mother's dedication. As young children, the twins were frequently dressed in matching outfits, their hair meticulously styled, a walking, breathing testament to Nikki's professional skills and maternal pride. Friends and extended family members routinely noted that the mother and daughters often acted more like close sisters, sharing clothes, music, and an infectious, high-energy dynamic that lit up any room they entered. The girls themselves were remarkably gifted. Jasmia and Tasmia, affectionately known as Jazz and Tas, were not just identical in physical appearance, they mirrored each other's fierce intellect and drive. Throughout middle school, they were consistent honor roll students, effortlessly earning straight A's and participating heavily in various extracurricular activities, including Girl Scouts, choir, and competitive dance. They were polite, well-spoken, and deeply embedded in their local community. To the casual outside observer, the Whitehead household was a stunning triumph of single motherhood. However, the transition from a modest background to middle-class suburban comfort came with intense, underlying pressures. Nikki was an incredibly strict disciplinarian. She firmly believed that maintaining absolute, uncompromising control was the only viable way to keep her daughters safe from the pitfalls she had faced. She established rigid boundaries regarding their curfew, the specific styles of clothes they were allowed to wear, and the friends they were permitted to keep. For a long time, the girls respected this rigid structure. They thrived under her intense guidance, consistently producing the exceptional academic results Nikki demanded. Yet, as the twins approached mid-adolescence, the insular, protected world the three of them had built began to fracture. Jazz and Taz rapidly developed their own distinct personalities, despite their identical physical features. They started fiercely craving personal autonomy. The matching dresses were discarded in favor of individual styles, and the once harmonious household slowly gave way to the inevitable friction of teenage rebellion. Nikki's romantic life also introduced a complicated new dynamic. She had been seriously dating a truck driver named Robert Head. Robert provided genuine emotional and financial stability, and he cared deeply for the girls. But his physical presence in the 2,500 square foot house shifted the delicate balance of the trio. The twins, accustomed to having their mother's undivided attention and sharing a somewhat horizontal power structure with her, suddenly found themselves subjected to the rules of a traditional two-parent household hierarchy. What began as typical teenage pushback, eye-rolling, missed curfews, and slammed bedroom doors soon mutated into something entirely different. The strict parameters Nikki had established out of love to protect her daughters were now perceived by the 16-year-olds as a suffocating, intolerable prison. The vibrant, loving home in Conyers was quietly setting the stage for a devastating psychological war. The teenage years introduced a highly volatile element into the Bridal Ridge residence. Jazz and Tass, once straight-A students and the pride of their mother's life, began to deliberately sabotage their academic records and their household standing. They skipped classes, forged report cards to hide failing grades, and openly flaunted their disobedience. Nikki responded the only way she knew how, by tightening her grip. She confiscated their cell phones, grounded them for weeks at a time, and locked away their favorite clothes. But these traditional disciplinary tactics, which might have worked on a single child, completely backfired against an identical duo. The twins operated as a synchronized front. They functioned as a psychological echo chamber. When one felt slighted, the other immediately amplified the grievance, forming an impenetrable, unified wall of defiance against their mother. The introduction of Robert Head into the daily routine only accelerated the collapse. The girls viewed Nikki's boyfriend as an illegitimate authority figure invading their territory. They openly mocked his attempts to mediate disputes, making it unequivocally clear they considered the 2,500 square foot house to belong solely to them and their mother. Arguments rapidly evolved from standard shouting matches into terrifying physical confrontations. The neighbors, who had once admired the beautifully manicured property, now frequently saw patrol cars idling in the driveway. Nikki began calling the local sheriff's department just to maintain basic order, using law enforcement as an improvised parenting tool. The twins, sharp and calculating, quickly learned how to weaponize that same system against her. The breaking point occurred in the summer of 2008. A mundane dispute over chores and curfew ignited into a violent brawl in the living room. Nikki, physically overwhelmed by two athletic, growing teenagers, fought back desperately to defend herself. When the police arrived, the girls immediately altered their demeanor. They played the victims flawlessly, pointing to superficial scratch marks and claiming their mother had attacked them unprovoked. Officers noted that the 16-year-olds were alarmingly calm, while Nikki was frantic and hysterical. Based on the physical marks, Nikki was arrested and temporarily charged with domestic battery, a devastating humiliation for a woman who had sacrificed her youth to build a life for her children. Although the charges were ultimately dropped, the psychological damage was absolute. The mother-daughter bond was entirely severed, replaced by cold, calculated hostility. Following the arrest, juvenile court authorities intervened, determining that the household was too toxic for the teenagers. Custody was temporarily granted to the girls' great-grandmother, Della Frazier, who lived a few miles away. For Jasmia and Tasmia, this was a massive, intoxicating victory. Della's home offered a far more lenient environment. The strict curfews evaporated, the rigid rules dissolved, and the twins tasted the absolute freedom they had been violently fighting for. They attended a different high school, partied with older crowds, and practically erased Nikki from their daily lives. But Nikki refused to let her daughters derail their futures. She genuinely believed Della's leniency was a direct path to delinquency and ruin. She spent the next 18 months fighting a grueling legal battle to regain custody. She attended mandatory counseling, completed anger management and parenting classes, and adjusted her work schedule to meet every single court requirement. She was determined to bring her girls back under her roof, convinced that her strict love was the only thing standing between them and total failure. The twins, meanwhile, actively fought against returning. They explicitly told court-appointed counselors they hated their mother, stating clearly that they would do whatever it took to stay away from her. The psychologists noted the girls' deep-seated anger, but fundamentally miscalculated its deadly potential, dismissing it as severe teenage angst. The legal system, prioritizing family reunification above all else, ignored the twins' warnings. On January 5, 2010, a juvenile court judge made a fatal ruling, declaring that Nikki had met all the state's demands and proven herself a capable parent. The court officially terminated Della Frazier's temporary custody. Jasmia and Tasmia were ordered to pack their bags and return to the Conyers subdivision immediately. The girls were absolutely devastated. They sat in the courtroom with their arms crossed, staring daggers at their mother, viewing the court order as a death sentence to their social lives. When the twins walked back into the two-story house that afternoon, the atmosphere was instantly suffocating. Nikki had won the legal war, but the enemy was now living inside her walls. The girls completely refused to speak to her. They communicated through icy glares and slammed doors, treating their mother like a hostile warden. Nikki, attempting to reestablish her dominance, immediately laid out a strict new set of rules, demanding perfect attendance at school and a complete cessation of their rebellious behavior. She drew a hard line in the sand, completely unaware that her daughters had already decided to cross it. The house went ominously quiet for 8 days. The countdown to January 13th had officially begun. The morning of Wednesday, January 13th, 2010. The sun had not yet crested the horizon over Conyers, leaving the Bridle Ridge subdivision bathed in a cold, pre-dawn gray. Outside, the temperature hovered at a bitter 32 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing the dew on the manicured lawns. Inside the 2,500 square foot house, the environment was infinitely colder. The 8 days of forced cohabitation had culminated in a suffocating psychological pressure cooker. Nikki Whitehead was already awake, dressed, and moving through the house. She had a busy schedule ahead, including errands and a hair appointment. The twins, Jasmia and Tasmia, were meant to be preparing for another day at Rockdale County High School. Instead, they remained barricaded in their bedrooms, their alarm clocks ignored, actively staging a silent protest against their mother's newly reinstated authority. Nikki refused to let the insubordination slide. She marched down the carpeted hallway, rapping sharply on their doors, demanding they get up and get dressed. The response was a heavy, defiant silence. When the 16-year-olds finally emerged from their rooms, there was no typical teenage grogginess, no sluggish shuffling. They were fully alert. They moved with a rigid, synchronized hostility, their identical faces set in matching expressions of deep contempt. They bypassed their mother entirely, walking into the kitchen. The kitchen, a sprawling space defined by polished granite countertops, light oak cabinetry, and light-colored linoleum flooring, was about to transform from the heart of the home into a slaughterhouse. Nikki followed them into the room, refusing to back down. She stood near the center island, demanding basic respect and outlining the severe consequences of their ongoing rebellion. She made it explicitly clear that she would not hesitate to contact juvenile authorities again. She threatened to have law enforcement drag them out of the house and label them as legally uncontrollable if they did not submit to her rules. For Jasmia and Tasmaya, this was the ultimate trigger. Returning to the strict confines of the court system or facing juvenile detention meant the permanent death of the freedom they had tasted at their great-grandmother's house. They did not scream. They did not throw a typical adolescent tantrum. Instead, they formed a solid physical wall in front of the lower cabinets. They verbally dismantled their mother, mocking her authority, their voices overlapping and amplifying each other into a singular, impenetrable wall of defiance. The argument rapidly breached the threshold of verbal hostility. The twins began to subtly shift their positions. They used their identical, athletic frames to box their mother in, cutting off her exit paths toward the carpeted living room. Nikki recognized the tactical shift. The standard maternal frustration evaporated in an instant, replaced by a sudden, freezing spike of genuine terror. She was a 34-year-old woman weighing barely 130 pounds. She was entirely trapped by two younger, stronger adversaries. She reached for the phone, intending to dial emergency services to defuse the escalating nightmare. The ambush commenced without a single warning cry. A heavy ceramic pot resting on the granite counter was weaponized. A sudden, violent swing. A devastating impact against Nikki's skull. The hollow, sickening crack of bone. Shattered ceramic exploded outward. Shards skittered across the linoleum, sliding under the refrigerator. Nikki staggered backward, her vision fractured. She lost her footing. The twins swarmed, no hesitation, no mercy. They tackled their mother to the hard floor. The physical assault was blindingly fast, brutal, unrelenting. Heavy blows rained down on Nikki's face, brutal kicks to her ribs. The 130-pound woman fought back with the absolute, primal adrenaline of survival. She clawed frantically at their faces. She sank her teeth deep into exposed forearms, tearing at the skin. She ripped at their hair, desperately trying to create an inch of breathing room. She was fighting a war against the very bodies she had carried and birthed. The mathematics of the ambush were impossible to overcome. Two relentless attackers against one disoriented, bleeding victim. They pinned her thrashing arms. They smothered her desperate cries for help. A hand reached up to the wooden knife block resting near the sink, the sharp, metallic scrape of steel being drawn from its slot. The violence shifted instantly from a vicious beating to a calculated execution. The blade descended, again and again, the sickening sound of metal tearing through fabric and flesh. Punctures to the chest, deep, jagged lacerations to the neck. The sheer volume of strikes, dozens of individual stab wounds, indicated a complete psychological rupture, a dam of hatred bursting. Blood sprayed in wide arcs across the pristine white lower cabinets. It pooled thick and dark, filling the grout lines of the floor. The heavy metallic scent of copper completely saturated the air, choking the room. Nikki slipped in her own blood, choking, gasping for air. But the struggle did not end in the kitchen. Bleeding profusely, Nikki managed to drag her battered body toward the hallway. She crawled on her hands and knees. She left thick, smeared handprints on the white baseboards, fighting for every inch of distance. The twins followed at a walking pace. They reached down and grabbed her by the ankles. They yanked her backward. A wide, horrifying trail of crimson painted the beige carpet, soaking deep into the fibers. They hauled her dead weight through the hallway, the friction burning against the floor. They dragged her over the threshold and into the master bathroom. The cold tile offered no sanctuary. The twins stood over her, breathing heavily, watching with cold detachment as their mother took her final, ragged, agonizing breaths. Her chest hitched one last time. It stopped moving. The bathroom went dead silent. The erratic, heavy panting of the 16-year-olds echoed sharply against the vanity mirrors. They looked down at the mutilated corpse on the tiles. There was no sudden realization of horror. There was no hysterical sobbing. There was no frantic call for an ambulance. Instead, Jasmia and Tasmia instantly initiated a chilling, synchronized cleanup protocol. They walked back down the hallway, their shoes leaving sticky, red footprints on the carpet. They returned to the kitchen. The space looked like an active war zone. They retrieved heavy-duty cleaning supplies from beneath the sink. The sharp, caustic chemical burn of bleach quickly overpowered the heavy, metallic smell of death. They poured the liquid directly onto the linoleum. They used kitchen towels to violently scrub the thickest pools of blood, but the effort was entirely futile. The blood had already seeped into the porous surfaces. It had soaked permanently into the carpet padding in the hallway. The sheer volume of the mess made sanitization impossible. Realizing they could not erase the crime scene, they pivoted to self-preservation. They stripped off their blood-soaked pajamas. They stuffed the ruined clothes, the shattered ceramic pieces, the murder weapons, and the saturated towels into heavy plastic garbage bags. They stepped into the showers. They watched the water run pink, then dark red, swirling down the drain as they washed their mother's DNA from their skin and hair. They scrubbed the dried flakes of blood from under their fingernails. They stood side by side before the fogged mirrors. They applied thick layers of foundation and concealer, meticulously masking the deep, stinging scratch marks and bite bruises Nikki had carved into their cheeks, necks, and arms during her desperate final defense. They flat-ironed their hair. They opened their closets and selected fashionable, pristine outfits. They sprayed heavy perfumes to neutralize any lingering scent of the bleach or the copper tang of blood. The morning sun was now fully up, casting bright beams through the windows of the silent house. The biological clock of the school day was demanding their presence. They needed an airtight alibi. The twins grabbed their backpacks, heavy with textbooks and unfinished homework. They walked out the front door, stepping into the freezing January air. They pulled the door shut, engaging the heavy deadbolt behind them. The house was successfully locked down like a suburban tomb, containing the butchered remains of their mother on the bathroom floor. Jasmia and Tasmia walked down the manicured sidewalk of the Bridal Ridge subdivision. They boarded the yellow school bus with the rest of the neighborhood kids. They rode the 20 miles to Rockdale County High School. They walked the crowded, noisy hallways. blending flawlessly into the massive stream of teenagers. They sat at their assigned desks. They took notes in class. They ate lunch in the cafeteria. They chatted casually with their peers about upcoming weekend plans and pop culture. For 8 solid hours, the 16-year-olds executed a perfect, chilling performance of mundane, everyday life, a meticulously manufactured alibi running precisely on schedule, while the ultimate horror waited silently for them back home. At 3:15 p.m., the heavy yellow Rockdale County school bus rumbled back into the Bridle Ridge subdivision, breaking the afternoon silence. The air brakes hissed loudly, the folding doors swung open, and Jasmia and Tasmia stepped out into the crisp 40-degree Fahrenheit air. They walked the remaining few hundred feet to their house, their heavy backpacks slung over their shoulders. To the neighbors glancing out their front windows, it was a perfectly mundane suburban tableau. The twins were chatting casually, their pristine outfits completely spotless, their hair meticulously flat-ironed. They walked up the wide concrete driveway, retrieved their keys, and unlocked the heavy front door. The performance began the absolute second the deadbolt clicked. They did not need to search the sprawling 2,500 square foot house to know what waited inside. The sensory assault was immediate and overwhelming. The stifling air trapped inside the residence was saturated with the caustic, burning fumes of industrial bleach, layered sickeningly over the dense, heavy copper scent of coagulated blood. The 16-year-olds dropped their backpacks in the tiled entryway. They lingered inside just long enough to establish a plausible timeline for their alibi of discovery, then bolted back out the front door, leaving it wide open to the freezing January wind. They ran out onto the manicured lawn, their arms flailing, their voices tearing through the quiet neighborhood. A Rockdale County Sheriff's deputy happened to be actively patrolling the subdivision, his cruiser rolling slowly down the street on a routine sweep. The twins sprinted directly toward the heavy 2-ton vehicle, frantically waving their arms and pointing back at the open door of their home. They effectively forced the deputy to slam on his brakes, the tires skidding slightly on the cold asphalt. The girls collapsed onto the street, hyperventilating, tearing at their pristine clothes, and wailing incoherently that something terrible had happened to their mother. The deputy instantly switched into tactical mode. He radioed dispatch for emergency backup, drew his standard-issue sidearm, and approached the open residence. The teenagers remained on the front lawn, executing a flawless, synchronized display of hysterical, blinding grief. The officer crossed the threshold. The environment inside was completely surreal. The house was dead silent, but the physical destruction spoke of absolute chaos. The deputy's eyes immediately locked onto the kitchen. The polished granite countertops were smeared with dark crimson arcs. The light-colored linoleum was completely covered in a horrific, slippery mixture of thick blood and foaming bleach. Shattered pieces of a heavy ceramic pot were scattered across the floor, mixed with overturned chairs and completely ruined kitchen towels. The sheer volume of blood suggested a frantic, prolonged struggle. The violence had clearly not been contained to the kitchen space. The deputy followed the gruesome trail deeper into the house. Wide, dark drag marks painted a terrifying path down the hallway, soaking deep into the beige carpet fibers. Smeared, bloody handprints marred the white baseboards, a desperate visual record of a woman fighting for her life while being hauled across the floor by a superior force. The officer moved slowly, his weapon raised, checking the corners of the hallway for any lingering threat. The trail ended abruptly at the threshold of the master bathroom. He stepped into the doorway and looked down at the cold tile. Nikki Whitehead lay motionless in an expansive pool of blood. The sheer brutality of the trauma was staggering. Her torso and neck were riddled with dozens of deep puncture wounds and jagged lacerations. Her face was heavily bruised, her ribs visibly crushed from heavy impacts. The extensive defensive wounds on her hands and arms indicated she had fought her attackers with everything she had, right until her final breath. The deputy quickly checked for a pulse, but the 34-year-old woman was completely cold. The blood pooling in the grout lines had already begun to separate and dry. There was absolutely nothing paramedics could do. The officer immediately backed out of the bathroom, careful not to step on the bloody drag marks, and secured the interior perimeter. He radioed dispatch, confirming a brutal homicide and requesting crime scene technicians and lead detectives immediately. Outside, the situation was rapidly escalating into a public spectacle. The piercing wails of the twins had drawn the attention of the entire Bridal Ridge community. Neighbors stepped out onto their porches, pulling their jackets tight against the chill, their faces pale with shock. Rumors ignited instantly and spread like wildfire. A home invasion, a targeted hit, a deranged burglar roaming the affluent streets of Conyers. The social echo was immediate and terrifying. If a hardworking mother could be butchered in broad daylight inside her locked, securely alarmed home, nobody in the subdivision was safe. Additional patrol cars swarmed the quiet street, their sirens cutting sharply through the winter air, their red and blue lights flashing violently against the brick facades of the neighboring houses. Paramedics arrived and immediately rushed to the 16-year-olds. Jasmia and Tasmia were wrapped in thick thermal blankets, shivering violently, tears streaming endlessly down their meticulously made-up faces. They leaned heavily on each other, sobbing uncontrollably into each other's shoulders, their performance of trauma absolutely unbreakable. When the lead homicide detectives arrived on the scene, their first instinct was absolute sympathy. They looked at the two beautiful, honor roll students weeping on the lawn and saw only profound tragedy. The investigators gently guided the girls to the back of an idling ambulance to keep them warm. The detectives spoke to them in soft, comforting tones, promising the grieving daughters that they would not rest until they found the monster who had slaughtered their mother, completely blind to the fact that they were offering comfort to the very architects of the slaughter. The homicide unit immediately locked onto the most statistically probable suspect in any domestic murder, the romantic partner. The sheer volume of puncture wounds and the intimate, close-quarters nature of the assault heavily suggested a crime of deep, personal passion rather than a random burglary gone wrong. Detectives brought Robert Head into the sterile, fluorescent-lit interrogation room. The trucker was subjected to hours of grueling, methodical questioning. Investigators pressed him hard regarding his relationship timeline, recent domestic arguments, and his precise whereabouts on that freezing Wednesday morning. He was informed that his presence in the house was a known point of friction. However, the boyfriend's alibi proved absolutely ironclad. Commercial trucking logs, satellite GPS data from his rig, and multiple third-party witness statements placed him securely behind the wheel, hundreds of miles away on an interstate highway when the fatal blows were struck. He was completely cleared. With the primary person of interest eliminated, investigators pivoted to the neighborhood rumor mill. The affluent subdivision was rapidly engulfed in paranoia. Residents flooded the tip lines, reporting suspicious vehicles and demanding increased patrols, terrified of a violent home invasion crew targeting suburban residences. But the physical evidence at the crime scene stubbornly contradicted the burglary theory. Crime scene technicians noted that the front door's heavy deadbolt had been engaged from the inside. There were no shattered windows, no pried hinges, and no muddy boot prints leading from the backyard. The victim's purse, credit cards, and expensive jewelry remained completely untouched on the bedroom dresser. The killers had not come to steal. They had come specifically to butcher. The investigative midpoint pivot occurred during a routine follow-up interview. Detectives needed to clarify the timeline with the only two surviving residents. While sitting across from the teenagers in the precinct, a seasoned investigator noticed a glaring visual anomaly. The girls were wearing an unusually thick, heavy layer of liquid foundation and thick concealer, not just on their faces, but slathered across their necks, forearms, and the backs of their hands. The cosmetic application was entirely inconsistent with typical adolescent makeup trends. It looked like heavy theatrical camouflage. The detective politely but firmly requested that the girls wipe their arms clean with a damp cloth. The fabricated narrative of a mysterious intruder began to disintegrate the absolute moment the makeup was removed. Beneath the thick cosmetics were severe, raw lacerations. Deep, parallel scratch marks tracked violently down their cheeks and necks. Jagged, dark purple bruises, unmistakably shaped like human dental arches, marred their forearms. When pressed by law enforcement to explain the fresh injuries, the siblings offered a remarkably clumsy, uncoordinated excuse. They claimed they had been involved in a minor, meaningless physical altercation with a rival peer at school a few days prior. The detectives knew instantly that a standard high school shoving match did not produce desperate, defensive bite wounds. The teenagers were immediately separated and escorted into different windowless interrogation rooms. Stripped of their psychological echo chamber and their ability to synchronize their reactions, the identical duo was forced to navigate the intense police questioning entirely alone. Investigators employed classic high-pressure interrogation tactics. They systematically dismantled the school fight excuse, noting that the campus resource officer had no record of any such incident. They attempted to play the sisters against each other, indirectly suggesting that one sibling was already in the process of trading a full confession for a lighter juvenile sentence. The officers observed a chilling behavioral shift. The hysterical, hyperventilating weeping that the girls had performed so flawlessly on the front lawn completely evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, impenetrable wall of calculating defiance. They sat rigid in their metal chairs. They strictly maintained that they had walked in at 3:15 p.m. and discovered the horrific aftermath. They insisted they had absolutely no knowledge of how their mother had met her end, casually dismissing the deep gouges in their own skin as completely unrelated to the homicide. Lacking the definitive forensic proof required to charge 2 minors with first-degree murder, law enforcement had no choice but to release them. But they did not let them leave empty-handed. Detectives secured comprehensive search warrants for the daughters' physical persons. Forensic technicians meticulously swabbed the bruised bite marks on their arms for trace saliva. They scraped the tissue from beneath their manicured fingernails. They confiscated the stylish, pristine outfits and shoes they had worn to school that day. The investigation then entered the most agonizing, frustrating phase for any homicide detective: the silent administrative wait for the state crime lab. Because of massive administrative backlogs, the testing process dragged on for months. During this excruciating interim, the twins moved back in with their great-grandmother. They attended classes, passed their exams, went to spring social events, and effectively walked free, living a completely normal teenage existence while the community remained paralyzed by the fear of a phantom killer. The detectives watched them closely, building a quiet, inescapable trap. In late May, the State Crime Laboratory finally delivered the comprehensive forensic report. The biological mathematics were absolute and devastating. The DNA profile extracted from the deep, torn epidermal tissue found beneath the victim's fingernails was a flawless, undeniable match to her daughter's. The microscopic traces of saliva swabbed from the bruised bite marks on the teenager's forearms perfectly matched the victim's dental records. Furthermore, forensic analysis of the plumbing in the house's bathrooms revealed heavy, concentrated pools of the victim's blood trapped in the P-traps of the shower drains, proving beyond a doubt that the killers had bathed on site to wash away the evidence. The final, fatal blow to their alibi came from the girls' confiscated footwear. Technicians discovered microscopic, high-velocity blood spatter on the soles and laces of the shoes they had worn to school, spatter that could only have been deposited by standing directly over a human body during a violent arterial assault. The meticulously constructed narrative of an afternoon discovery was completely annihilated. The timeline was definitively rewritten by the science. The evidence proved that the fatal ambush occurred in the early morning hours, long before the yellow school bus ever arrived. The grieving daughters were not the tragic, traumatized survivors of a random home invasion. They were the cold-blooded architects of their own mother's slaughter. The subsequent arrests were executed swiftly in late June. Law enforcement located the siblings at different residences, one remaining at the great-grandmother's property, the other visiting a friend, and officially took them into custody. Due to the calculated, exceptionally brutal nature of the ambush, the prosecutor's office elected to try the teenagers as adults, effectively exposing them to the absolute maximum penalties under the law. They remained entirely steadfast in their denial for over 3 years, languishing in a county detention center while awaiting trial. The unified wall of defiance only began to crumble when the overwhelming weight of the forensic evidence was systematically laid out during pre-trial hearings. Specifically, the microscopic blood spatter and the DNA extracted from under the victim's fingernails. Realizing the state possessed an airtight narrative built entirely on their own biological markers, the psychological echo chamber finally collapsed. In early 2014, to avoid the absolute certainty of a drawn-out, highly publicized trial and a potential life sentence without the possibility of parole, the sisters accepted a plea agreement. They officially pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and related criminal charges. The presiding judge sentenced both individuals to serve 30 years in a state penitentiary. Their admissions of guilt in the courtroom were delivered with chilling detachment, offering only cold, tactical concessions to the overwhelming biological facts presented against them, rather than any genuine expression of remorse. The Bridle Ridge subdivision eventually returned to its quiet routines, yet a permanent, heavy shadow lingered over the pristine lawns. The community never truly recovered from the psychological shock that the ultimate threat came from inside a locked, heavily alarmed home. Jasmia and Tasmia Whitehead fought a brutal, escalating war for teenage autonomy, viewing their mother's strict love as an intolerable prison. In their chilling pursuit of absolute freedom, they executed a calculated slaughter, ultimately securing themselves 3 decades inside a literal cage. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. It is a paradox that defies human comprehension. A beloved family of 5, slaughtered in the pitch-black silence of their own bedrooms. The scene was a canvas of absolute devastation, heavy with the metallic scent of unimaginable rage. Yet the most terrifying element was not the calculated brutality of the bludgeoning itself. It was the chilling reality that the man who discovered their broken bodies, the man weeping before the flashing cameras, was the exact same monster who swung the hammer. He wiped away their entire future, not for financial gain, but out of a quiet, simmering envy that had completely rotted his core. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. North Epping sits approximately 12 miles northwest of Sydney's central business district. It is the type of affluent, tree-lined suburb where crime statistics are historically a footnote, characterized by manicured lawns, 2-story brick homes, and a profound sense of isolation from the city's grit. The residents value their quiet privacy and routine. It was within this pristine enclave on Boundary Road that the Lin family built their sanctuary, a physical manifestation of a grueling, relentless pursuit of prosperity. 45-year-old Min Lin and his 43-year-old wife, Yun Lee, known to her customers as Lily, were the absolute embodiment of the immigrant work ethic. They did not inherit their wealth. They extracted it through sheer physical and mental endurance. The couple owned and operated the Rawson Street News Agency, a business that demanded a punishing schedule. Their day routinely began at 3:30 in the morning. While the rest of the neighborhood slept, Min and Lily were already awake, navigating the bitter 40-degree Fahrenheit winter mornings to sort massive incoming deliveries. Running a highly successful news agency is not a passive investment. It requires severe manual labor. Min routinely hauled tightly bound stacks of newspapers and magazines weighing upwards of 50 pounds, breaking them down, organizing delivery routes, and managing a constant influx of inventory. Lily meticulously handled the logistics, the finances, and the retail floor. The Rawson Street shop was a high-traffic hub. Customers filtered in incessantly during their morning commutes, purchasing lotto tickets, stationery, and daily broadsheets. Min and Lily stood on their feet for over 10 hours a day, their hands constantly stained with the dark ink of newsprint. Despite the exhausting repetition, they maintained an immaculate storefront, heavily outperforming competing businesses in the surrounding miles. By the time the sun breached the horizon, their store was the beating heart of the local community. Min commanded the front counter with absolute efficiency, recalling the specific purchasing habits of hundreds of locals. He was a fixture in their daily routines, noting exactly what they needed before they even reached the register. The financial success of the news agency was undeniable, but the Lins did not work 14-hour days for personal luxury. Every dollar earned was funneled directly into the future of their children. They had 3, 15-year-old Brenda, 12-year-old Henry, and 9-year-old Terry. Min and Lily constructed an impenetrable financial fortress to guarantee their children would never have to endure the same exhausting physical labor. The boys and their older sister were enrolled in top-tier schools, attended private tutoring, and participated in expensive extracurricular activities. The parents demanded academic excellence, providing every conceivable resource to ensure their children's upward mobility. The Lin household on Boundary Road was a bustling, multi-generational hub. Lily's 39-year-old sister, Yun Bin, who went by Irene, also lived with the family. Irene was a university student who frequently helped out at the news agency during peak hours to ease the burden on her sister and brother-in-law. She integrated seamlessly into the daily chaos of the home, acting as a second mother to the boys when Min and Lily were trapped behind the store counter. From the outside, the Lin family represented the ultimate triumph. They had crossed oceans, mastered a new culture, and dominated their local economy through nothing but grit and unity. Their expansive, heavily furnished home was a trophy of their endurance. They were respected by their neighbors, beloved by their customers, and deeply devoted to their lineage. They had structured a life that felt entirely insulated from failure or danger. However, this very success, the visible, undeniable proof of Min's dominance as a provider, was silently generating a toxic byproduct within their own extended family. The wealth they accumulated to protect their children was simultaneously acting as a mirror, reflecting the perceived inadequacies of those standing just outside the immediate glow of their prosperity. Migration acts as a brutal equalizer. It strips away past titles, former prestige, and established social standing, demanding that an individual prove their worth from scratch in a foreign landscape. For some, like the owners of the Rawson Street news agency, this blank canvas was an opportunity to build an empire through relentless physical endurance. But for others, the loss of status is a psychological poison. This was the exact reality for Robert C. Born Lian Binxie, Robert had once commanded immense respect in Guangzhou, China. He was a highly educated ear, nose, and throat specialist, an intellectual, a man of science, and a physician accustomed to the absolute deference of his patients and peers. However, his medical credentials held zero currency upon his arrival in Sydney. To legally practice medicine in his new country, he would have to endure years of grueling retraining, subordinate internships, and complex examinations in a second language. He absolutely refused to submit to this perceived humiliation. Instead of adapting to the harsh realities of the immigrant experience, Robert sought shortcuts to establish his financial dominance. He temporarily relocated to Melbourne, venturing into the hospitality industry by opening a restaurant. It was a catastrophic failure, collapsing under poor management and draining his resources. Defeated and humiliated, he retreated to Sydney, settling into a modest home on Beck Street. This residence was located barely a quarter of a mile from the sprawling Boundary Road estate. That short physical distance would become the breeding ground for a lethal, all-consuming jealousy. Robert became perpetually unemployed. He spent his days sealed inside his home, staring at computer screens, attempting to day trade on the stock market with thoroughly mediocre results. He was reduced to relying entirely on the financial support of his wife, Kathy, who was Min's younger sister. In the context of traditional family hierarchy, this dynamic was fundamentally emasculating. Within the extended family, Min was the golden son, the undisputed patriarch, and the ultimate provider. The elderly parents of Min and Kathy had also immigrated and resided with Robert and Kathy on Beck Street. Yet the elders' adoration was entirely monopolized by their successful son. Every family dinner, every holiday gathering, and every casual afternoon tea mutated into an agonizing audit of Robert's inadequacies, cleverly disguised as praise for Min. The elders endlessly highlighted the news agency's soaring profits, the flawless academic records of their grandchildren, and the sheer work ethic of the man providing for them all. Robert possessed a highly volatile combination of grandiosity and deep-seated insecurity. He viewed himself as intellectually superior in every conceivable metric. In his mind, Min was merely a manual laborer, a man who unglamorously hauled heavy bundles of magazines and counted loose coins behind a retail counter. Robert was a doctor, yet the universe was heavily rewarding the laborer, while actively punishing the intellectual. This cognitive dissonance festered into a quiet, toxic rage. He could not escape the radiant glow of his brother-in-law's success. He was forced to watch Min purchase luxury vehicles, fund elite private tuitions, and command the respect of the entire community. Outwardly, Robert expertly constructed the facade of the benevolent, doting uncle. He was a constant presence at the Boundary Roadhouse. He positioned himself as a mentor, regularly tutoring the young boys in advanced mathematics and playing badminton with them in the backyard. He smiled for the cameras during family birthdays and presented himself as a pillar of familial support. But those who looked closely enough could see the microfractures in his mask. He was deeply critical of the news agency's operations. He frequently offered unsolicited business advice, proposing aggressive expansion strategies and attempting to insert himself into the financial decision-making process. Min politely but firmly rejected every single proposal. Min did not need the guidance of an unemployed relative who had already bankrupted a restaurant. To a narcissist like Robert, these gentle rejections were perceived as catastrophic, unforgivable insults. The concept of losing face was slowly destroying his sanity. He felt invisible, disrespected, and utterly useless. Robert rationalized that if the current patriarch were permanently removed from the equation, the family structure would naturally reset. The wealth, the business, and the ultimate authority would default to him. He would finally become the savior and the head of the dynasty. By the winter of 2009, this simmering envy had crystallized into a chilling tactical objective. Robert knew the architecture of the Boundary Road Sanctuary intimately. He knew the precise schedules of every occupant, the location of the main electrical breaker box, and the fact that their punishing work hours guaranteed they would sleep like the dead. The sharp analytical intellect he had once utilized to heal patients was now completely repurposed. In the silence of his home, surrounded by failing stock charts and the oppressive weight of his own mediocrity, he meticulously designed the total annihilation of his own blood. Friday, July 17, 2009. The end of another grueling shift. The heavy metal shutters of the Rawson Street news agency rattled downward, locking away the daily profits. Min and Lily drove the short distance back to Boundary Road. Their bodies ached. The sheer physical toll of hauling 50-pound bundles of newsprint all week left them completely drained. They entered their fortress. They ate a late meal with Irene and the two boys. The house was secured. The alarm was set. The lights clicked off, one by one. By midnight, the Boundary Road residence was completely silent. The occupants fell into the deep, heavy sleep of the overworked. A quarter of a mile away on Beck Street, there was no sleep. Robert C. was wide awake. His wife, Kathy, was asleep in their bed. The elderly parents were resting down the hall. The house was quiet. Robert dressed carefully. He layered dark clothing to absorb any potential spatter. He laced up a specific pair of Asics running shoes, chosen for their quiet traction. He gripped a heavy, modified tool, a weapon resembling a mechanic's hammer, spliced with a martial arts rope device. Its weight was perfectly balanced to maximize kinetic impact and minimize the effort required for repeated swings. He slipped out the back door into the biting cold. The temperature had dropped to a bitter 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The winter air was sharp, cutting. He walked the familiar route. No vehicle, no engine noise, just the rhythmic crunch of rubber soles on cold pavement. The neighborhood was a ghost town. No streetlights illuminated his path. He navigated the shadows with the precision of a surgeon. He reached the perimeter of the Boundary Road estate. The house stood massive and imposing in the dark. He moved to the exterior brick wall. He knew exactly where the main electrical box was mounted. He opened the metal panel. He grabbed the main breaker. Click. Inside the house, the low hum of the refrigerator ceased. The digital clocks on the microwaves and ovens went black. The exterior motion sensor floodlights died. The alarm system, dependent on the main power grid and lacking a backup battery, was instantly neutralized. Absolute suffocating darkness fell over the property. Robert approached the front entrance. He did not break a window. He did not pry a lock. He possessed a key, a spare granted to him out of pure familial trust. The metal cylinder turned smoothly. The heavy oak door swung open. He stepped inside. The air inside was warm, thick with the scent of a sleeping family. Robert did not need light. He knew the architecture of this house better than he knew the charts of his failing stocks. He knew the exact distance from the foyer to the base of the staircase. He began the ascent. The wooden stairs groaned slightly under his weight. He adjusted his stance, pressing his boots against the extreme edges of the steps to muffle the sound. He moved slowly, methodically. He reached the second-floor landing, 4 bedrooms, 5 targets. He moved to the master suite first, the primary objective, Min and Lily. The door was already ajar. The rhythmic, deep breathing of the couple echoed in the enclosed space. Robert approached the right side of the mattress, Min's side, the patriarch, the man who cast the shadow. Robert could not escape. He raised the heavy, weighted weapon high above his shoulder. The first strike was catastrophic. A sickening, wet crunch shattered the midnight silence. Min never woke up. The impact instantly neutralized his central nervous system. Lily jolted. The violent movement beside her severed her sleep. Before her eyes could even adjust to the pitch black, the weapon came down again. Short, brutal, unforgiving. The mattress sank under the sheer force of the blows. The breathing stopped. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The warmth was replaced by the overwhelming, heavy metallic scent of pooling blood. It sprayed across the headboard, coated the walls, soaked deep into the heavy duvet. Robert did not pause. The adrenaline was peaking. The kinetic energy was already flowing. He turned away from the ruined bed. He stepped out of the master suite. The second door. Irene. She was a remarkably light sleeper. The muffled thuds from the adjacent room had disturbed her. As Robert pushed her door open, she was already moving. She sat up. The darkness obscured the intruder's face, but the threat was absolute. Irene fought back. She did not surrender to the shadows. She scrambled against the wall, kicking out, her hands thrashing in the dark to deflect the incoming strikes. The confined space of the bedroom became a chaotic battleground. The heavy breathing of the attacker, the desperate gasps for air, the dull, heavy impacts of metal crushing bone. She managed to deflect the weapon away from her skull for a fleeting second, taking the crushing blows to her forearms. Her bones snapped under the sheer force of the swinging hammer. But she was trapped. The assault was relentless. The weapon bypassed her shattered guard. It found its mark. The struggle ended. A heavy silence crashed back over the room, interrupted only by the steady dripping of liquid onto the carpets. 3 dead, 2 remained. The boy's bedroom was situated at the far end of the hall. 12-year-old Henry and 9-year-old Terry. The violent struggle in Irene's room had not been silent. The plaster walls had vibrated. The muffled screams had carried down the corridor. The boys were awake. They were terrified, paralyzed by the incomprehensible nightmare unfolding in the pitch black of their own home. They had no place to run, no phone to reach. Robert stepped into their doorway. He was no longer the doting uncle who played badminton in the backyard. He was a faceless, blood-soaked silhouette, blocking their only exit. Henry, the older brother, moved first. Pure survival instinct drove him out from under the covers. The weapon swung in a vicious horizontal arc. The boy was struck down before he could cross the center of the room. Terry, small and defenseless, was trapped against his bed frame. The sheer brutality required to annihilate a 9-year-old boy in his pajamas defies human logic. But Robert was operating entirely on the toxic fuel of his own envy. These boys were the heirs to the empire he coveted. They were the living extensions of Min's financial dominance. They had to be erased to reset the hierarchy. The strikes rained down. The overkill was staggering. It was not just a clinical elimination. It was a physical manifestation of years of deep-seated humiliation and rage. The structural integrity of the bedroom was completely compromised. Blood saturated the carpets, the school books, the toys. Then, it was over. The massacre was complete. The house was completely still. The only sound was Robert's own ragged, heavy breathing echoing in the dark. He stood in the hallway, surrounded by the total devastation of his own bloodline. The scent of copper was so thick, it burned the back of his throat. His muscles burned from the extreme physical exertion of swinging the heavy tool dozens of times. He looked down. In the darkness, he could not see the floorboard, but he felt the slick stickiness gripping the rubber soles of his sneakers. He took a step backward. His right foot pressed onto a section of the hardwood floor near the master bedroom. The blood transferred from the complex tread pattern of his shoe directly onto the polished wood. a single, partial impression. It was microscopic in the grand scheme of the carnage, a tiny, nearly invisible error hidden in the pitch black. But it was there. Robert turned and walked back down the stairs. He navigated the foyer. He opened the front door. The freezing 40-degree air hit his face, a jarring, stark contrast to the stifling, metallic heat radiating from the second floor. He pulled the door shut behind him. The lock clicked. He stepped off the porch and merged back into the shadows of Boundary Road. The suburban street remained perfectly undisturbed. Not a single dog barked. Not a single neighbor turned on a light to investigate. The affluent enclave slept on, completely oblivious to the fact that one of its most prominent families had just been violently wiped from existence. Robert walked the quarter-mile back to Beck Street. He slipped through his back door. He stripped off the dark, saturated clothing. He thoroughly cleaned the heavy, blunt weapon, ensuring no organic material remained in the grooves. He packaged the Asics sneakers for total disposal. He stood in the shower. He washed the blood from his skin. The physical evidence swirled down the drain, leaving behind only the cold, hard reality of what he had accomplished. He returned to his bed. He lay down next to his sleeping wife. He closed his eyes. He waited for the sun to rise. Saturday morning dawned crisp and bitterly cold over North Epping. By 5 a.m., the intersection outside the Rawson Street News Agency was already bustling with its usual heavy foot traffic. Commuters, construction workers, and early morning walkers pulled their coats tight against the chilling wind, anticipating the warm glow of the storefront and the familiar, efficient presence of Min and Lily. Instead, they found a solid metal barricade. The heavy steel security shutters remained tightly locked, anchored firmly to the concrete pavement. Massive bundles of the Saturday edition newspapers, weighing hundreds of pounds in total, were piled haphazardly on the frost-covered sidewalk, entirely untouched by the owners who usually broke them down hours before sunrise. For any other retail establishment, an unexpected closure might simply warrant a passing annoyance. For the Lin family's meticulously run business, it was the equivalent of a blaring air raid siren. They had not missed a single morning shift in years. The community knew the owner's punishing work ethic intimately. A delayed opening was not a scheduling error. It was a definitive, alarming anomaly. As the clock pushed past 7 a.m., the crowd of frustrated regulars dispersed, rapidly replaced by a creeping communal anxiety. Whispers began circulating among the adjacent shop owners. Phone calls to the Lins went straight to voicemail. The absolute silence from the usually hyper-communicative couple was terrifying. Just a few miles away on Beck Street, Robert Z. was already awake, carefully constructing the next critical phase of his grim theater. He knew the news agency had failed to open. He knew the frantic phone calls from neighbors were going unanswered. The timing of his next move had to be precise. Around 9 a.m., he positioned himself in his newly acquired role, the deeply concerned patriarch in waiting. He and his wife, Kathy, got into their vehicle and made the short, familiar drive to the Boundary Road estate to check on their relatives. The exterior of the massive brick home was perfectly undisturbed. The morning sun illuminated the manicured front lawn, revealing absolutely no signs of forced entry. Kathy used her spare key to unlock the heavy oak front door. They stepped into the expansive foyer. The house was freezing. The main electrical breaker remained tripped, leaving the interior trapped in a heavy, unnatural darkness, despite the bright daylight pressing against the drawn window blinds. Kathy called out for her brother. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings, met only with a suffocating, heavy silence. The air inside the residence was incredibly thick, tainted with an overwhelming, sickly sweet metallic odor that caught sharply in the back of the throat. It was the undeniable scent of massive biological trauma. They moved to the base of the staircase. The tension in the quiet house was agonizing. Kathy ascended first, her footsteps slow and hesitant on the hardwood. Robert followed closely behind her, navigating the exact same wooden steps he had climbed with a heavy weapon just hours prior. They reached the second-floor landing. The door to the master suite was wide open. The visual impact was absolute and world-shattering. The walls, the ceiling, the heavy oak furniture, everything was painted in dark, saturated crimson. The physical devastation inflicted upon Min and Lily was so extreme that Kathy's brain could not immediately process the carnage. The structural integrity of the bedroom had been turned into an absolute slaughterhouse. She collapsed heavily against the doorframe, her knees completely buckling under the sheer horror of the discovery. A visceral, soul-tearing scream shattered the suffocating silence of the Boundary Road sanctuary. Robert immediately launched into his meticulously rehearsed performance. He grabbed his wife, physically restraining her from entering the ruined room. He navigated the hallway, glancing quickly into Irene's destroyed bedroom, and then toward the boys' quarters at the far end of the hall. He explicitly blocked Kathy from moving forward, strictly instructing her not to look at the children's room, warning her that the visual was completely unbearable. He cast himself as the protector, the brave shield against the nightmare. Robert dialed emergency services. The audio recording of that emergency call remains a masterclass in calculated deception. He instructed the dispatcher to send police immediately, his voice completely saturated with feigned hyperventilation and manufactured hysteria. He provided the Boundary Road address, loudly weeping into the receiver, repeating that his wife's brother and his entire family had been murdered. He told the operator that there was blood everywhere. He ensured his tone conveyed absolute shock, completely masking the exhausted, burning muscles in his own shoulders, the lingering physical toll of swinging a heavy blunt instrument dozens of times in the pitch black. Within 10 minutes, the piercing wail of sirens cut through the quiet suburban air. Multiple police cruisers, emergency medical units, and heavily armored forensic vans flooded Boundary Road, aggressively mounting the curbs and establishing a massive containment perimeter. The blinking blue and red lights illuminated the affluent street, drawing horrified neighbors out of their pristine brick homes in their winter coats. When veteran crime scene investigators breached the front door, even they froze. The sheer volume of blood pooling on the second floor made it nearly impossible to navigate the hallway without destroying potential forensic evidence. The social echo of the crime was instantaneous and completely paralyzing. North Epping was not accustomed to violent crime, let alone the total, systematic annihilation of an entire family unit. As the staggering scale of the massacre began to leak through the yellow police tape, a viral panic infected the community. Residents who had left their doors unlocked for decades suddenly installed heavy steel deadbolts and complex alarm systems. Local hardware stores sold out of security equipment within 48 hours. The fear was completely suffocating. Wild theories immediately saturated the neighborhood network. The sheer brutality and overkill of the bludgeoning suggested a professional hit. Rumors circulated rapidly that the successful news agency was merely a front, that Min owed massive, unpayable debts to organized overseas triad syndicates, or that it was a highly targeted, racially motivated hate crime designed to send a terrifying message to the immigrant business community. The Rawson Street storefront was quickly transformed into a massive, makeshift memorial, buried under thousands of floral bouquets and handwritten letters. The police were facing a populace that was completely terrified, aggressively demanding immediate answers for an incomprehensible level of violence. And in the absolute center of this swirling vortex of community terror, sitting heavily on the cold concrete curb outside the active crime scene, was Robert Z. He was surrounded by flashing press cameras, sympathetic neighbors, and uniformed officers. He wept openly, burying his face in his hands, perfectly playing the role of the utterly broken survivor. The man who had manually destroyed an entire bloodline was now eagerly absorbing the condolences of the very community he had just violently traumatized. The New South Wales State Crime Command Homicide Squad inherited a scene of unparalleled devastation. The physical evidence was severely compromised by the sheer volume of biological material. Blood spatter coated the ceilings, walls, and heavy oak furniture, creating a chaotic forensic puzzle that would take months to properly decode. The immediate working theory heavily leaned toward organized crime. The extreme overkill, the complete neutralization of the entire household, and the severing of the main power grid suggested a highly trained syndicate. Detectives spent the first 6 months completely consumed by this angle. They tore through the financial ledgers of the news agency, searching for hidden gambling debts, triad extortion attempts, or offshore money laundering schemes. They interviewed hundreds of suppliers, casual customers, and distant associates, desperately looking for any friction. Every lead evaporated into nothing. The victims were a fundamentally honest, hard-working unit with zero ties to the criminal underworld. The investigation then briefly chased the specter of a racially motivated hate crime, mirroring the absolute panic currently gripping the local community. But this theory also collapsed rapidly under severe scrutiny. There was no manifesto, no vandalism, no signature left behind to send a political message. The detectives were hitting a solid brick wall. The frustration within the precinct was palpable. They needed to stop looking outward and pivot sharply back to the physical architecture of the crime scene itself. The analysts stripped away the visual chaos and focused purely on the cold logistics of the attack. The perpetrator navigated a massive, multi-level property in absolute pitch-black darkness. They did not trip over furniture. They did not mistakenly enter the empty guest rooms. They moved with a chilling, practiced efficiency directly to the occupied bedrooms. Furthermore, there was absolutely zero evidence of forced entry. The heavy front door had been opened smoothly with a key. A professional hitman dispatched by a syndicate would not risk a prolonged, chaotic physical struggle using a heavy weapon. They would have utilized a suppressed firearm for a clean, rapid extraction. The instrument used on Boundary Road was intensely personal. It was a heavy, customized blunt object, likely a hammer modified with a rope to prevent it from slipping from blood-soaked hands. Wielding it required immense physical exertion, close proximity, and sustained, blinding rage. This was not a contract killing. It was a manual execution engineered by someone standing firmly inside the family's inner circle. The investigative lens aggressively refocused on the surviving relatives. Robert C. had positioned himself at the absolute center of the tragedy, acting as the primary spokesperson and the weeping protector of his traumatized wife. But veteran interrogators began noticing distinct micro-expressions. His grief appeared heavily rehearsed, almost theatrical. His timeline contained a massive, unverified void between midnight and the morning discovery. He confidently claimed to have been asleep the entire night, but the psychological profile being assembled by behavioral analysts suggested something far darker. They uncovered the deep, festering resentment stemming from his failed restaurant venture and his total financial reliance on his wife. The stark contrast between his grandiose self-image as a former medical specialist and his current reality as an unemployed dependent provided the exact toxic motive required for such an atrocity. To trap a highly intelligent, narcissistic suspect, the police initiated Strike Force Norburn. They secured covert warrants to completely wire Robert's world. Listening devices were embedded deep within his residence on Beck Street and hidden inside his vehicles. Detectives monitored his phone calls and tracked his daily movements through the city. Concurrently, to visually map the suspect's movements through the darkness, forensic imaging teams utilized advanced 3D scanning technology to build a precise, high-resolution digital model of the house. This high-end rendering allowed analysts to track the exact trajectories of the weapon swings and the sequence of the violence, definitively proving the attacker possessed an almost surgical knowledge of the victim's sleeping arrangements. The digital reconstruction completely destroyed the theory of a random home invasion. A terrifying psychological cat and mouse game developed. Detectives intentionally fed Robert fragmented pieces of information during casual interviews to gauge his reactions. He desperately attempted to steer the conversation back toward the triad theories, even offering unsolicited tactical advice to play the intellectual equal. The police allowed him to spin his web of lies, methodically building an impenetrable wall of evidence, while he remained completely unaware that every confident smile and frustrated sigh was being secretly cataloged. Despite the psychological certainty, the authorities needed physical, undeniable proof. It finally emerged from the microscopic analysis of the ruined master suite. Amidst the catastrophic damage, forensic technicians isolated a single, partial footprint, transferred onto the polished hardwood floor. It was formally cataloged as Stain 91. The impression was incomplete, but the complex rubber tread pattern was highly distinctive. The authorities collaborated extensively with footwear manufacturing experts, eventually identifying the specific make and model, the Asics Galkyrios running shoe. The sizing was calculated exactly between a US 8.5 and 9.5. The surveillance net finally caught its prey. While actively monitoring Robert, Detectives captured audio of him discovering that the police were inquiring about Asics footwear. The hidden microphones recorded the frantic sound of him destroying physical evidence. He was heard violently dismembering shoeboxes and aggressively flushing unknown materials down his toilet. Furthermore, forensic teams executed a search warrant on his home and found microscopic traces of blood matching the victims secreted away in the drain of his garage. He had meticulously cleaned himself and his weapons on the night of the slaughter, but the extreme volume of the carnage made total sanitization biologically impossible. The tactical patience of the detectives had paid off. The red herrings were entirely discarded. The net was pulled tight. The narcissistic facade of the untouchable doctor was completely shattered by a single, bloody footprint and his own paranoid whispers captured in the dark. The wheels of justice turned with agonizing slowness. On May 5th, 2011, nearly 2 years after the massacre, Robert C. was formally arrested. What followed was a grueling legal marathon spanning 4 separate trials. The first aborted due to legal technicalities. The second derailed when the presiding judge fell ill. The third ended in a hung jury, the defense relentlessly attacking the footprint analysis, desperately attempting to resurrect the Phantom Triad syndicate theories. But the prosecution's narrative was an impenetrable fortress. During the final trial, the Crown systematically dismantled Robert's benevolent facade. They presented the covert audio recordings, the destroyed Asics shoeboxes, and the microscopic blood evidence pulled from his garage drain. They painted a devastating portrait of a severely narcissistic man driven to annihilation by pure, unadulterated envy. In January 2017, the 4th jury finally delivered the verdict. Robert D. was found guilty on all 5 counts. A month later, he was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The disgraced doctor was permanently isolated in a concrete cell, a stark, final demotion for a man who had slaughtered his own bloodline to steal their crown. Production note for freelance editors. When building the visual assets for this segment, utilize our standard 3D rendering style for the courtroom sequences. Keep the color grading stark and high contrast, ensuring it seamlessly matches the established True Crime Chronicles aesthetic. The Boundary Road estate was eventually sold, its dark history scrubbed clean by new owners. But for the lone survivor of the Lynn family, the nightmare is permanent. The eldest daughter was away on a school trip when her parents, aunt, and young brothers were violently slaughtered. She returned to a completely shattered world, utterly unaware that the uncle who eagerly took her in was the exact architect of her grief. Robert C. did not just steal her family. He forced her to live with the very monster who erased them. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. 3 polished mahogany caskets sit side by side in a heavy, incense-filled church. Inside lie a father, a mother, and an 18-year-old girl, all victims of a calculated massacre. At the podium stands the sole survivor. His face is pale, streaked with genuine tears. He grips the microphone and sings a breathtakingly beautiful eulogy. The congregation weeps, pitying the orphaned son, but their grief is entirely misplaced. The young man singing this hymn is not a tragic survivor. He is the architect of the slaughter, staring down at the wooden boxes containing the bloodline he butchered with his own hands. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Teddy and Mary Loiva Gonzalez did not just want a better life when they relocated from the Philippines to the affluent, sun-baked suburbs of Sydney, Australia. They demanded an exceptional one. Teddy was a man of relentless, almost clinical ambition. He had been a highly respected lawyer in his home country, and upon arriving on foreign soil, he absolutely refused to settle for the struggles of a typical immigrant. He rebuilt his career from the ground up, establishing a wildly lucrative immigration law practice and amassing a formidable real estate portfolio. Mary Loiva was his equal in drive, a woman who meticulously managed their social standing. ensuring the family projected an image of absolute, unshakable prestige. Their two-story brick home on a quiet, manicured street was a fortress of traditional values. The air inside always smelled faintly of lemon polish and expensive incense, a physical manifestation of Mary Loiva's demand for perfection. But beneath the polished surfaces, the walls hummed with immense, suffocating pressure. The parents' love was undeniable, yet it was deeply transactional, tethered exclusively to academic excellence and flawless public behavior. In this high-stakes environment, 18-year-old Claudine thrived. She was the genuine, perfect child, a living monument to her parents' sacrifices. Claudine was a gifted student, a talented pianist, and unconditionally obedient to the punishingly strict curfews laid down by her father. The house often echoed with the crisp, precise notes of her evening piano practice. It was a sound that brought Teddy and Mary Loiva immense comfort. She was on a direct, unwavering trajectory toward a prestigious career. Claudine was the golden investment that was paying off exactly as planned. Then there was the firstborn, the only son, 20-year-old Seth. In their traditional household, the eldest son carried the crushing weight of the family legacy. He was the heir apparent, expected to eventually take the reins of the patriarch's empire. Teddy had mapped out Seth's entire existence before the boy could even speak. He was ordered to study medicine, become a top-tier physician, and elevate the Gonzalez name to even greater societal heights. But Seth was not built like Claudine. He possessed a sharp mind, but it was entirely disconnected from the grueling discipline of medical school. He craved the aesthetics of wealth, the sleek sports cars, the designer clothes, the effortless respect of his peers. But he despised the relentless labor required to actually earn it. The friction between father and son was constant. It was a low-grade tremor that continuously threatened the foundation of their home. Teddy did not negotiate. Every dropped grade, every missed expectation was met with harsh reprimands, revoked privileges, and the ultimate threat: complete financial excommunication. The Gonzalez household became an arena of quiet, cold warfare. Upstairs, Claudine studied tirelessly under the warm glow of parental approval. Downstairs, Seth sat in the heavy, freezing shadow of an impossible standard. His father's demands felt less like guidance and more like a tightening noose. The family's pursuit of excellence had created a beautiful, gleaming facade, completely blinding them to the dark, malignant resentment silently festering in the mind of the perfect son. The University of New South Wales was supposed to be the prestigious proving ground for the family's heir. Enrolled in rigorous medical science courses, the young man was expected to easily transition into a highly respected, high-earning profession. But the sprawling campus lecture halls rarely saw him. While his younger sister remained at home, dutifully perfecting complex piano sonatas and studying late into the night, the older brother was carefully constructing an elaborate, full-time double life. He spent his days wandering the affluent commercial districts of Sydney, playing the role of a carefree, wealthy playboy. He cultivated an image of effortless superiority among his peers, spending hours lounging in high-end cafes, buying rounds of drinks, and purchasing designer clothing he had absolutely no way of legitimately affording. He was thoroughly addicted to the aesthetics of high society, but utterly allergic to the grueling labor required to actually belong there. To fund this relentless charade, the young man began quietly siphoning money from his parents' accounts. It started small, funds supposedly earmarked for expensive medical textbooks, and university fees were diverted straight into his personal wardrobe and his bustling social life. He eventually resorted to pawning pieces of his mother's expensive jewelry and manipulating stolen credit cards. A significant portion of this illicit capital went toward maintaining a relationship with a young woman he was desperately trying to impress. He knew with absolute certainty that if the illusion of his immense wealth evaporated, his social standing and his romantic life would collapse immediately alongside it. Simultaneously, the patriarch of the family demanded constant proof of academic excellence. The son delivered exactly what was asked of him, just not legitimately. He transformed his quiet bedroom into a highly efficient forgery workshop. Utilizing consumer editing software and high-quality cardstock, he meticulously altered his failing university transcripts. He erased his abysmal failing grades and replaced them with top-tier marks, carefully matching the institution's typography and duplicating the official university crest. When he handed these falsified documents to his father, he played the part of the dutiful student flawlessly. He accepted his parents' proud praise with a modest smile, entirely unfazed by the staggering weight of his own deception. For a long time, the counterfeit reality held. The family celebrated his fabricated achievements, completely unaware that their golden boy was actually facing severe academic probation and impending expulsion. But his appetite for luxury was growing far too rapidly, significantly outpacing his ability to steal unnoticed. He desperately wanted a new, aggressively expensive sports car, a physical status symbol to permanently cement his fabricated image. He began heavily pressuring his family to purchase it for him, aggressively citing his stellar, though completely forged, academic record as leverage. This relentless demand for capital proved to be his fatal error. The father, a man whose entire self-made fortune was built on a foundation of meticulous attention to legal and financial details, finally began to notice the undeniable discrepancies. The numbers were simply not aligning. The exact moment the illusion shattered was catastrophic for the household. Investigating the persistent financial irregularities, the patriarch contacted the university administration directly, effectively bypassing the carefully manufactured paper trail. The truth hit the family home with the concussive force of a detonating bomb. The father discovered that not only was his son failing miserably, but the entire academic portfolio was a calculated multi-year fraud. The boy was not a medical prodigy, he was an academic ghost. Furthermore, the missing household funds were tracked directly to his extravagant, unauthorized lifestyle. The resulting confrontation permanently poisoned the atmosphere of the house. The father did not merely scold his son, he systematically dismantled his entire existence. Through cold, uncompromising ultimatums, Teddy made his intentions brutally clear. The financial pipeline was permanently severed. The luxury car was immediately denied. The generous allowance was permanently terminated. Furthermore, the patriarch issued the ultimate unforgivable sanction. He intended to legally disinherit his firstborn. The vast real estate empire, the lucrative law practice, the millions in accumulated savings. All of it would bypass the son entirely and be handed down exclusively to the obedient, genuinely successful sister. The young man was coldly informed that he would soon have to pack his bags, leave the comfortable suburban fortress, and survive entirely on his own. For a narcissist abruptly stripped of his supply, desperation rapidly ferments into something highly toxic. He found himself backed into an impossible, suffocating corner. If he was cast out, his girlfriend would inevitably leave him. His peers would discover his absolute failure. He would be reduced to a menial, blue-collar existence, a fate he genuinely considered worse than death. The environment inside the brick home became a psychological prison. Meals were eaten in suffocating silence. His car keys were confiscated, and his movements were strictly monitored. As he sat in his freezing shadow, listening to the muffled, perfect notes of his sister practicing the piano downstairs, his resentment mutated into clinical, unadulterated malice. He did not feel an ounce of remorse for his lies. Instead, he felt an intense, burning hatred toward his father for withdrawing the funds he believed were his divine birthright. In his twisted psychological framework, the problem was not his own deceit. It was his parents' control over the bank accounts. And his sister was no longer family. She was a financial rival who was about to steal his empire. If the patriarch successfully altered the will, the money would be lost forever. However, if the parents were to suddenly pass away before those complex legal documents could be officially changed, the original will would stand. As the sole surviving son, he would automatically inherit everything. A chillingly pragmatic thought took root in the dark corners of his mind. He began quietly utilizing the household computer to research lethal poisons and toxic plants, searching for a quiet, untraceable way to erase his bloodline. He stopped viewing his mother, father, and sister as human beings. They were simply breathing obstacles, standing between him and a $6 million inheritance. The walls were closing in, and the perfect son decided the only way to escape was to butcher his way out. Tuesday, July 10th, 2001. The air outside the affluent suburban fortress was crisp, hovering steadily around 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the sprawling two-story brick home, the environment was perfectly still. The 20-year-old son stood alone in the center of the pristine kitchen, surrounded by the expensive imported appliances his parents had sacrificed decades to acquire. He moved toward a heavy wooden block on the granite countertop. The sharp, metallic scrape of steel against wood broke the absolute silence as he extracted two long, heavy carving knives, each boasting an 8-inch serrated blade. Next, he retrieved a solid 30-inch wooden baseball bat from a storage closet. He carried these items into the front foyer, his footsteps muffled by the thick, expensive Persian rugs. He carefully staged the weapons in the deep shadows near the base of the grand wooden staircase. The young man was no longer a failing university student, terrified of his father's wrath. He had transformed himself into a predator, waiting patiently in a blind. At approximately 4:30 p.m., the front lock clicked. The heavy oak door swung inward. The 18-year-old sister stepped into the foyer, dropping her heavy school backpack onto the polished hardwood floor. She kicked off her shoes, her mind likely focused on her rigid evening piano practice schedule or upcoming university exams. As she walked toward the center of the house, the perpetrator stepped out from the blind spot near the stairs. He raised the wooden bat and brought it down with concussive, devastating force. The impact was deafening in the quiet house, but the first strike was not lethal. The young woman screamed, spinning around to face her attacker. The mild confusion in her eyes instantly morphed into sheer, unadulterated terror as she recognized the face of her own brother. She fought back with feral intensity. The struggle spilled violently from the elegant hallway into the adjacent study. She clawed, kicked, and desperately tried to block the ensuing blows with her bare arms. The physical reality of murder is rarely as clean or efficient as it appears on television. It is exhausting, chaotic, and incredibly loud. Realizing the blunt force trauma was insufficient to silence her quickly enough, the perpetrator dropped the bloodied bat. He reached into his waistband and produced one of the kitchen knives. The pacing of the attack immediately shifted from blunt, frantic aggression to lethal, mechanical precision. He drove the blade forward. The ensuing wounds to her neck and chest were catastrophic. After a prolonged, desperate fight for her own survival, the genuine, perfect child of the family collapsed onto the carpet. The perpetrator stood over her, his chest heaving heavily, adrenaline surging through his veins. He did not panic. He did not reach for a telephone. He simply bent down, grasped his sister's lifeless body, and callously dragged her further into the study, concealing her completely from the front entryway. The house fell back into a suffocating, heavy silence. The sharp, metallic smell of copper began to mingle deeply with the faint, ever-present scent of lemon furniture polish. The perpetrator walked to the downstairs bathroom. He turned on the brass faucet, watching the pale red water swirl down the porcelain drain as he meticulously washed his hands. He checked his watch. It was roughly 5:30 p.m. He retrieved the second carving knife from the shadows. He returned to his position in the foyer. He waited. The distinct sound of a vehicle pulling into the driveway signaled the arrival of the second target. The mother unlocked the front door, her arms likely burdened with work documents or evening groceries. She stepped into the dim entryway, immediately calling out to the house. No response came. She took a few steps inward, her eyes struggling to adjust to the low indoor light. She noticed the dark, wet smears streaked across the hardwood floor. Before her brain could fully process the horrific scene, her son lunged from the darkness. This second ambush was completely devoid of hesitation. The perpetrator attacked with a ferocity that bordered on the clinical. The mother had absolutely no time to defend herself, drop her bags, or comprehend that her executioner was the child she had carried and raised. The blade struck with devastating speed. The attack was concentrated entirely on her throat and upper torso, severing major arteries in a matter of milliseconds. She fell heavily to the floor in the hallway, the life draining from her body almost instantly. The killer stood above the woman who gave him life, his face locked in a mask devoid of any human empathy. He was no longer looking at a mother. He was simply executing a necessary financial transaction. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the blood-soaked floors. The ambient temperature dropped. Inside, the perpetrator sat quietly in the encroaching darkness. He did not turn on the overhead lights, knowing that sudden illumination would entirely ruin the final, most crucial ambush. He waited in the pitch-black house for over an hour. This intermission required a chilling, almost psychopathic level of psychological detachment. He was sitting mere feet from the butchered remains of his family, yet his heart rate likely steadied. He simply gripped the handle of the remaining knife, his muscles cramping from the immense physical exertion of the previous violence, his mind fixated entirely on the $6 million estate waiting at the finish line. At 6:50 p.m., the heavy, authoritative footsteps of the patriarch echoed loudly on the front porch. The brass lock turned. Teddy pushed the door open, stepping into the pitch-black foyer. He reached blindly for the wall switch. The sun struck before the artificial light could expose the slaughter. The father was a formidable man, highly driven, physically strong, and deeply authoritarian. When the first thrust of the blade pierced his chest, he did not immediately fall. A brutal, agonizing struggle erupted in the confined space of the entryway. Teddy realized instantly he was fighting for his life, though the absolute darkness obscured the identity of his attacker. He grabbed the serrated blade with his bare hands, desperately trying to wrestle the weapon away from his assailant. The defensive wounds inflicted on his palms and fingers were horrific, the steel cutting straight through tendons and scraping against bone as he fought the relentless, driving assault. But the son pushed forward, fueled by 3 years of festering, toxic resentment and the looming, terrifying threat of a blue-collar existence. He drove the patriarch backward, overpowering the older man through the sheer violent advantage of the initial ambush. The father's resistance began to fade rapidly as massive blood loss took its inevitable toll. A final, devastating thrust targeted the neck, severing the spinal cord completely. The patriarch collapsed onto the floor, his heavy frame coming to rest near the entryway. The long, silent psychological war within the brick house had concluded in less than 3 hours. The sudden silence that followed was deafening. The perpetrator stood alone in the dark. His breathing was ragged, his clothing completely soaked in the heavy evidence of his unimaginable betrayal. But his work was far from finished. He needed a narrative, a fabricated, highly visible story to hand directly to the local police. He walked to a utility closet and retrieved a can of spray paint. He moved toward a pristine, light-colored wall in the main living area. He shook the can. The metallic rattle of the mixing ball inside echoed sharply through the tomb-like house. He pressed the nozzle and painted a massive, aggressive racial slur across the drywall. It was a calculated, highly theatrical red herring. By staging the horrific scene as a violent, targeted hate crime, he fully intended to manipulate the detectives into chasing phantom extremists, ensuring they would look everywhere except at the weeping, orphaned survivor. The staging complete, the young man moved with terrifying efficiency. He He stripped off his ruined clothing, gathering the blood-soaked garments, the leather shoes, the wooden bat, and the 2 carving knives. He stuffed them all into a heavy-duty plastic garbage bag. He walked back to the downstairs bathroom, quickly washing the remaining physical evidence from his face and arms. He dressed in clean, highly fashionable clothes, pulled from his upstairs bedroom. He picked up the heavy garbage bag, stepped out the back door into the freezing night air, and quietly locked the house behind him. He walked to his vehicle, placed the evidence bag deep in the trunk, and started the engine. He did not look back at the suburban fortress. Instead, he drove directly toward the neon lights of the city, intending to spend the next several hours wandering through crowded arcades and bustling entertainment districts. He was about to begin the performance of a lifetime, meticulously constructing an airtight, time-stamped alibi while his entire bloodline lay slowly cooling on the hardwood floors. He walked through the front door, stepping over the cold remains of his family, and reached for the telephone. The ensuing call to emergency services was a masterclass in calculated theatrical hysteria. He hyperventilated heavily into the receiver, his voice cracking with manufactured terror as he informed the dispatcher that he had just walked into a nightmare. He wailed uncontrollably, insisting through simulated sobs that his parents and sister were covered in blood, and that he did not know if the armed intruders were still hiding inside the sprawling house. The dispatcher, hearing the primal, escalating panic of a seemingly traumatized survivor, immediately ordered him to flee the premises and dispatched multiple patrol units and ambulances to the address. When the first responders arrived with sirens blaring, they found the young man waiting outside on the manicured lawn. He was trembling violently, clutching his head in his hands and dry heaving into the grass. Inside the residence, seasoned law enforcement officers were physically repulsed by the sheer, unadulterated brutality of the scene. The heavy, metallic scent of iron hung thick and stagnant in the air, completely overpowering the household's usual smell of expensive cleaning supplies. The pristine walls were heavily compromised by arterial spray. The massive, aggressively painted racial slur in the living room immediately commanded the detective's full attention. The initial assessment pointed entirely away from domestic violence. The staggering scale of the slaughter, combined with the offensive graffiti, suggested a highly coordinated, lightning-fast attack by multiple perpetrators, most likely an extremist hate group targeting successful minority immigrants. News of the massacre spread through the affluent community like a seismic shockwave. This was a neighborhood defined by its exceptionally low crime rates, luxury vehicles, and meticulously manicured lawns. The sudden, violent extermination of an entire household shattered the fragile illusion of suburban safety. Absolute panic set in overnight. Rumors circulated wildly among the residents that a roaming, racially motivated kill squad was actively operating in their zip code. Local hardware stores completely sold out of heavy deadbolts, motion sensor lights, and high-end alarm systems within hours. Families who had comfortably lived with their doors unlocked for decades suddenly barricaded themselves inside. Children were abruptly pulled from after-school activities, and the usual evening neighborhood walks ceased entirely. The fear in the community was palpable, thick, and suffocating. The residents rallied fiercely around the sole surviving son, universally viewing him as a tragic, orphaned victim who had escaped the exact same horrific fate by sheer blind luck. The young man absorbed this massive wave of public sympathy and weaponized it flawlessly. He stepped directly into the glaring media spotlight, willingly granting highly publicized interviews to local and national television stations. Standing in front of a battery of news cameras, his eyes appropriately red and swollen, he delivered a chillingly convincing performance. He begged the anonymous killers to come forward, pleading with the public to provide any information that might lead to justice for his slaughtered relatives. He articulated his immense, crushing grief, stating that his future had been completely destroyed and that he felt entirely hollowed out by the unimaginable loss. Viewers sitting in their living rooms across the country wept openly for him. His elaborate performance reached its absolute zenith during the joint funeral service. The massive church was packed far beyond its fire code capacity, with terrified neighbors, grieving classmates, and sympathetic strangers. The 3 heavy wooden caskets sat prominently at the front of the altar, surrounded by hundreds of expensive floral arrangements. When the time came for the eulogy, the young man slowly walked up the central aisle, leaning heavily on the shoulders of extended relatives as if he could barely support his own weight. He took the microphone, and instead of simply reading a prepared statement, he sang a delicate, breathtakingly mournful hymn. His voice was remarkably steady, hitting every note with deep, emotive resonance. The entire congregation broke down. The raw sound of collective sobbing echoed loudly off the vaulted ceiling. He stood there, looking down at the boxes containing the people he had personally butchered, soaking in the absolute adoration and profound, misguided pity of the massive crowd. He had successfully convinced the entire world that he was a victim. He believed his multi-million-dollar inheritance was completely secure, and that the police were actively chasing phantoms. He felt utterly, terrifyingly invincible. The initial weeks of the investigation were an exercise in immense, grinding frustration for the local homicide squad. They were staring at a sprawling suburban crime scene that made absolutely no logical sense. The sheer brutality of the 3 murders, coupled with the massive, aggressively spray-painted racial slur dominating the living room wall, initially forced the detectives to look outward. Operating on the assumption that the theatrical staging was genuine, the police department poured thousands of man-hours into chasing phantoms. They rigorously tracked local extremist groups, interviewed informants, and scoured the affluent zip code for any signs of a roaming, highly organized kill squad. The community remained trapped in a state of suffocating panic, with neighbors continuing to barricade themselves indoors, terrified that the xenophobic murderers would return. Concurrently, investigators dug deeply into the patriarch's lucrative professional life. Teddy Gonzalez was a formidable immigration attorney and a wealthy real estate mogul. He routinely dealt with large sums of money, complex legal disputes, and occasionally deeply disgruntled clients facing deportation. Detectives painstakingly built profiles on business rivals, former partners, and anyone who might harbor a violent, simmering grudge against the family. But every single promising lead quickly evaporated into nothing. The extremist groups had no footprint in the manicured neighborhood, and Teddy's professional rivals all possessed ironclad, verified alibis. The red herrings were slowly blinding the investigation. The critical turning point occurred when seasoned investigators deliberately stepped back from the noisy, theatrical elements of the crime scene and focused purely on the cold, physical logic of the brick house. The narrative of a random, racially motivated hate crime was beginning to heavily fracture under the weight of basic common sense. Hate crimes are overwhelmingly fast, chaotic, and emotionally explosive. The perpetrators breach a location, inflict massive damage, and immediately flee to avoid capture. But the killer inside the Gonzalez home had been terrifyingly, unnaturally patient. There was absolutely no sign of forced entry on any of the heavy oak doors or first-floor windows, meaning the executioner either possessed a key or was freely let inside by the victims themselves. Furthermore, the medical examiner's analysis of blood coagulation and pooling indicated the murders were not a simultaneous blitz. The killer had violently ambushed the 18-year-old sister, successfully hidden her body, and then simply waited. He ambushed the mother and then waited again in the pitch-black house for over an hour for the father to return from work. This level of methodical, icy patience pointed directly away from chaotic extremists and strongly toward an individual intimately familiar with the family's exact daily schedule. The investigative spotlight slowly, inevitably swiveled away from the terrified community and locked directly onto the grieving, orphaned son. He had confidently provided detectives with a seemingly bulletproof, time-stamped timeline. Heavily supported by crumpled convenience store receipts, and witness sightings at a crowded, deafeningly loud downtown arcade. However, forensic pathology systematically dismantled his entire story. Based on the victim's stomach contents, the ambient indoor temperature of the climate-controlled house, and the established routine arrival times of the mother and sister, the medical examiner drastically narrowed the exact window of the massacre. The extreme violence had occurred strictly between 4:30 p.m. and 7 p.m. The surviving son's meticulously documented arcade visit, the core of his airtight defense, did not actually begin until nearly 8 p.m. He had effectively provided a flawless alibi for the aftermath of the crime, but his whereabouts during the actual slaughter were entirely unaccounted for. When veteran detectives sat him down in a sterile interrogation room and gently pressed him on this massive, glaring discrepancy, his carefully constructed calm faltered. His breathing shallowed, his eyes darted, and his explanations became increasingly convoluted, shifting from a confident narrative to a stuttering mess of contradictions. As the timeline shattered, the physical evidence began pointing exclusively, damningly inward. Forensic technicians analyzing the massive racial slur in the living room determined the exact chemical composition and brand of the paint. It was not an exotic aerosol brought into the house by a roaming gang. The chemical signature perfectly matched a half-empty can of spray paint found discarded deep inside the family's own utility closet. The killer had utilized the household's own supplies to manufacture the hate crime illusion. But the absolute most devastating piece of evidence was pulled directly from the digital ether. Cyber investigators seized the Gonzalez family computer from the upstairs study and conducted a deep, exhaustive forensic dive into the hard drive. They bypassed the standard, easily cleared browsing history and recovered heavily deleted search logs tied specifically to the 20-year-old son's personal user profile. In the weeks immediately preceding the massacre, the young man had not been studying for his fabricated medical exams. He had been obsessively scouring the internet for untraceable lethal poisons, toxic plants, and silent methods for erasing a human life. This digital footprint definitively proved intense premeditation. He had originally intended to poison his bloodline quietly, before his desperation forced him to resort to blunt force and serrated kitchen steel. If the mounting physical and digital evidence formed the foundation of his legal ruin, the young man's own staggering clinical arrogance provided the final nail. He genuinely believed he had successfully outsmarted the veteran homicide detectives. He assumed the mask of the weeping orphan had rendered him completely untouchable. Just days after publicly sobbing over his family's caskets and delivering that breathtaking, widely televised eulogy, he marched directly into a high-end luxury car dealership. He confidently ordered the exact same aggressively expensive sports car his slaughtered father had explicitly denied him weeks earlier. To secure the massive financial loan, he casually offered his impending $6 million inheritance as official collateral. He also began actively contacting real estate agents, inquiring about rapidly selling the sprawling suburban fortress where his parents and sister had just bled to death. There was absolutely no mourning period, no trauma, only a frantic, cold-blooded rush to liquidate the newly acquired assets. The detectives, quietly monitoring his every financial move and phone call, realized with absolute certainty that they were not dealing with a traumatized survivor. They were tracking a highly narcissistic apex predator who had systematically butchered his own family simply to gain unfettered access to their bank accounts. The net was fully closed. The arrest was completely devoid of the theatricality the young man craved. In June 2002, detectives quietly approached him in a public space. There were no flashing lights or screaming sirens, just the cold, heavy click of steel handcuffs closing around his wrists. He did not fight back. The performance was finally over. Inside the sterile courtroom, the meticulously constructed facade of the weeping orphan disintegrated completely. Prosecutors methodically laid out the undeniable physical and digital evidence, painting a stark clinical portrait of a narcissistic predator who viewed his own family entirely as financial assets to be aggressively liquidated. The defendant sat at the heavy wooden table, his face locked in a rigid, emotionless mask as his fabricated reality entirely collapsed around him. The legal resolution struck the exact nerve he had killed to protect. Under the state's strict forfeiture laws, a murderer cannot legally profit from their violent crimes. The entire $6 million estate, the lucrative business assets, the sprawling properties, the heavily guarded savings, was permanently stripped from his grasp and redirected to extended relatives. He had systematically butchered his bloodline for absolutely nothing. The presiding judge handed down the absolute maximum penalty available. The young man was sentenced to 3 consecutive terms of life imprisonment, accompanied by a strict judicial stipulation firmly denying any future possibility of parole. He was officially permanently removed from society, condemned to sit in a highly monitored, maximum security concrete cell for the remainder of his natural life. The sprawling brick home in the affluent suburbs was eventually scrubbed clean, the heavy Persian rugs replaced, the walls repainted. It was sold to strangers who likely never knew the true depth of the horror that occurred in the foyer. The pursuit of absolute perfection created a monster who valued a bank account over the very people who gave him life. He sits today in a concrete cell, stripped of his name, his inheritance, and his freedom. The perfect son became the perfect executioner. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. October 24th, 2005, Ocilla, Georgia. A pristine white house sits locked under the heavy 80-degree sun. Inside, absolute silence. The doors are deadbolted. A car sits in the driveway, engine cold. But inches from the manicured front lawn, resting on dry pine needles, lies a single anomaly. An off-white, powdered latex glove. It smells faintly of chemical rubber, a stark contrast to the blooming sweet olive. This sterile barrier is the only flaw in a perfect scene. The woman who lived here is gone. She will not be seen again. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Ocilla, Georgia, spans exactly 3.4 square miles. It is a quintessential southern enclave where the humidity hangs thick, often pushing past 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the late summer, and secrets are historically impossible to keep. With a population of barely 3,500 residents, the social ecosystem operates on absolute familiarity. Neighbors recognize the distinct sound of each other's vehicle engines. The congregation at the local church serves as the ultimate town square, and anonymity is nothing more than a myth. In a place this small, everyone knows your daily routine. At the absolute center of this tightly knit web was 30-year-old Tara Faye Grinstead. She was not merely a resident, she was a local institution. Born with an intense internal drive for excellence, Tara navigated a life defined by a fascinating, almost cinematic duality. To the casual observer, she was the ultimate portrait of Southern grace. As a former Miss Tifton who had graced the stage competing for the highly coveted title of Miss Georgia, she possessed a practiced poise. Her appearance was always immaculate, perfectly styled hair, tailored clothes, and a radiant camera-ready exterior. Yet the rhinestone crowns and evening gowns were only a fraction of her identity. Behind the glamorous veneer was a fiercely dedicated, highly independent intellectual. Tara spent her days navigating the cinderblock hallways of Irwin County High School. As an 11th grade history teacher, she traded the spotlight for chalkboard dust and the heavy responsibility of shaping young minds. She was not an educator who simply clocked in and out. She demanded excellence, running a strict but deeply empathetic classroom. Her psychological makeup was rooted in constant self-improvement. Tara was actively pursuing her doctorate in education, spending her quiet evenings poring over dense academic texts under the warm glow of her living room lamps. She wanted to eventually step into an administrative role to actively reshape the educational landscape of her rural district. Furthermore, Tara weaponized her pageant experience for the benefit of the next generation. She spent countless weekends mentoring local teenage girls, teaching them interview skills, posture, and public speaking. She offered them a blueprint for building self-worth in a county where outside opportunities could feel painfully scarce. She was the woman young girls aspired to become, and the teacher parents trusted implicitly. Her sanctuary from this relentless schedule was a historic single-story house on West Park Street. The property was a direct reflection of her disciplined mind, meticulously maintained, beautifully decorated, and secure. She lived alone, sharing the space only with her beloved dog, Hermann. The German Shepherd mix provided both fierce companionship and a comforting layer of security for a single woman building a life on her own terms. In a town where time often felt like it moved at the slow, deliberate pace of a dripping faucet, Tara Grinstead was a force in constant motion. Her upward trajectory was obvious to everyone who crossed her path. She was constructing a substantial, unshakable future, and it is precisely this vibrant, heavily documented, and highly visible life that makes her sudden, total evaporation so entirely incomprehensible. A woman so deeply anchored to her community, a woman who meticulously plans her week down to the hour, does not simply walk out the door and disappear. Irwin County High School is the undisputed nerve center of the region. In rural districts spanning miles of agricultural space, the local educational facility serves as much more than a place of learning. It is the social, cultural, and athletic pulse of the entire community. The building itself is a standard mid-century structure, long corridors lined with battered metal lockers, cold cinder block walls painted in institutional colors, and the permanent scent of industrial floor wax masking the heavy humidity that seeps in from the Georgia clay outside. For the teenagers navigating those halls, the social hierarchy is absolute. Status is dictated by football jerseys, family lineage, and proximity to the agricultural wealth that surrounds the town. Within this intense microcosm, the history teacher held a unique and highly respected position. Her classroom was a strictly controlled environment. She enforced rigid academic standards, requiring her students to actively engage with the material rather than simply memorize dates. Yet, despite her demanding syllabus, her room was considered a sanctuary. She understood the specific pressures of growing up in a geographically isolated area. She listened to her students' frustrations, offering guidance on college applications, career paths, and life beyond the county lines. However, she maintained an impenetrable professional boundary. She was a mentor, never a peer. Her authority was never questioned, largely because she projected an aura of complete self-assurance. To comprehend the fracture that was about to occur, one must understand the specific demographic divide within the school's alumni. Every graduating class in a town this size produces two distinct types of young adults. There are those who use their diplomas as a stepping stone to leave, or to build substantial, respectable lives locally. And there are those who remain tethered to the town, slowly sinking into a stagnant routine of low-wage labor, substance abuse, and fading high school glory. Graduating 3 years prior to the incident, the class of 2002 included two young men who represented the latter category, though they originated from vastly different backgrounds. The first was Bo Dukes. In this region, the Dukes name carried significant economic weight. His family owned a sprawling, highly profitable pecan orchard just outside the city limits. Bo grew up with the distinct privilege that accompanies land ownership in the Deep South. He navigated his teenage years with a potent blend of charm and arrogance. A young man accustomed to having his transgressions quietly smoothed over by family influence. He was loud, charismatic, and heavily entitled. Following graduation, he enlisted in the military, a path that briefly suggested a turn toward discipline. But his service was marred by misconduct, leading to an eventual discharge that sent him right back to his hometown. He returned not as a humbled veteran, but as a restless, volatile presence. someone who viewed local laws and social norms as suggestions rather than hard rules. The second figure was Ryan Duke. Despite sharing a phonetically identical last name, Ryan was not related to Bo. Furthermore, their social standings were entirely opposite. Ryan grew up in a fractured home environment, completely devoid of the financial safety nets that caught Bo every time he fell. In high school, Ryan was a relatively capable athlete. He played on the tennis team and possessed a quiet, unassuming physical strength, but he was fundamentally a follower. He lacked the aggressive charisma of his peers, preferring to blend into the background to avoid conflict. As the years passed after graduation, Ryan's trajectory angled sharply downward. He succumbed to severe substance abuse, developing dependencies that further eroded his ambition and his physical health. He became a passive vessel, a quiet, compliant shadow, trailing behind louder, more dominant personalities. These two young men forged an unlikely but deeply toxic codependency. Bo provided the transportation, the resources, and the chaotic energy. Ryan provided an audience and an absolute lack of resistance. They spent their days drifting through the county, drinking heavily, consuming narcotics, and cruising the empty rural highways in an old white pickup truck. Their connection to the history teacher was minimal but verified. Both had sat in her classroom. She had graded their papers, monitored their exams, and likely recognized the vast differences in their potential. But by the fall of 2005, they were merely ghosts from her professional past. She was hyper-focused on her doctoral studies and her upwardly mobile career. They were completely consumed by their next high. There was absolutely no logical reason for their worlds to intersect again. They existed in completely separate stratospheres of the local ecosystem. She represented discipline, beauty, and ambition. They represented the darkest, most stagnant corners of the county. Yet, in a town measuring barely 3 square miles, physical proximity often overrides social distance. The heavy air of the region held a creeping desperation, a tension fueled by the sprawling, silent pecan orchards that bordered the town. Those orchards, characterized by perfectly straight rows of towering trees and soft, sandy soil, were completely isolated. At night, they offered absolute darkness and total secrecy. Saturday, October 22nd, 2005, brought a heavy, stagnant heat to the region. The humidity clung to the pavement, amplifying the scent of fried dough, roasting sugar, and diesel exhaust. It was the weekend of the annual Sweet Potato Festival, an event that temporarily swelled the local population and completely disrupted the usual quiet rhythm of the county. The streets were choked with slow-moving pickup trucks and pedestrians. For Tara, this was not a day of leisure. It was a day of intense, highly visible social obligation. She spent the daylight hours immersed in the chaotic energy of the local beauty pageant, utilizing her extensive background to manage the contestants. The environment inside the auditorium was stifling, a dizzying mix of aerosol hairspray, nervous adrenaline, and the glare of stage lighting. Tara operated with her signature precision, adjusting evening gowns, offering technical advice on walking postures, and keeping the schedule moving. It was exhausting, highly social labor. By the time the crowns were awarded and the auditorium began to empty into the warm evening air, she had been on her feet for nearly 12 hours. Seeking a brief decompression, Tara drove to a relaxed barbecue hosted by a former school superintendent. The gathering was small, consisting of colleagues and close acquaintances. The atmosphere was a stark contrast to the high-voltage energy of the pageant. She ate a light meal, engaged in casual professional conversation, and finally allowed her rigid posture to relax. As the clock approached 11 p.m., she signaled her departure. She politely informed her hosts that her exhaustion had peaked and she desperately needed to return home to sleep. She walked out to her vehicle, the gravel crunching under her tires as she backed out of the driveway. The drive to West Park Street was incredibly brief, barely a few miles of empty, dark residential roads. Upon arriving home, the transition from public figure to private individual began. The house was quiet. The German Shepherd mix greeted her at the door. Tara went through her evening routine. She removed the heavy stage makeup, took off her jewelry, and changed into comfortable sleepwear. The doors were secured, the exterior lights were extinguished. The air conditioning hummed a low, mechanical rhythm against the southern heat. She laid down, expecting the deep, dreamless sleep of the entirely exhausted. Miles away, the night was operating on a distinctly different frequency. Ryan Duke was completely consumed by chemical dependency. The craving for narcotics had overridden any remaining sense of logic or self-preservation. He needed cash, and he needed it immediately. He was completely out of resources, out of favors, and desperate. His physical state was deteriorating, muscle tremors, a racing heart, the sickening cold sweat of impending withdrawal. In this state of singular, blinding need, he began to wander the dark residential streets. He was not looking for a specific target. He was hunting for an opportunity. A house that looked vulnerable, a vehicle with an unlocked door. He eventually found himself on West Park Street. The historic single-story house sat in complete darkness. To Ryan's drug-addled mind, it simply represented a quiet, isolated structure, a place where a purse might be resting on a kitchen counter, a place where a few $100s could be quietly extracted while the occupants slept. He approached the property, his boots sinking silently into the dry pine needles covering the yard. He moved to the rear of the house. The security protocols that Tara usually maintained were comprehensive, but in a town of 3 square miles, a single overlooked detail is all it takes. He found a point of entry, a door that yielded. He slipped inside. The transition from the humid outdoor air to the cool, dark interior was jarring. He stood perfectly still, letting his eyes adjust to the heavy shadows. The house was dead silent, save for the hum of the appliances. He began to move through the rooms, stepping carefully to avoid creaking floorboards. He was not a hardened, tactical criminal. He was a trembling addict acting on raw impulse. Then, the silence broke. Tara woke up. The exact sensory trigger remains known only to her, a shadow crossing the ambient light of the window, a scuffling sound on the hardwood floor, or the sudden, terrifying realization of a foreign presence in her sanctuary. She did not freeze, she reacted. The low-tension atmosphere shattered instantly. He panicked. She fought back. Adrenaline flooded his system. He lunged. The struggle was sudden, uncoordinated, and violently physical. He was cornered, terrified of being caught, terrified of this strong, athletic woman who was actively fighting for her life in the dark. He struck her. The impact was heavy. She fell back. The fight ended as abruptly as it began. Ryan stood over her in the crushing silence of the bedroom. His breathing was ragged, catching in his throat. He waited for her to move. She did not. The reality of the situation rapidly crushed the haze of his withdrawal. He had not found cash. He had committed murder. Blind panic took control. He could not leave her there. The instinct to erase the massive mistake overrode everything else. He needed to get her out of the house. His hands shook violently as he grabbed a quilt from the bed. He wrapped her body in the heavy fabric, struggling under the dead weight. Every sound in the house now felt like an alarm. The dog barked, a sharp, confused sound. But Ryan ignored it. His focus entirely narrowed on the logistics of removal. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of latex gloves. He snapped them onto his sweating hands, a sudden, desperate attempt to prevent leaving fingerprints on the doors or the fabric. He gripped the heavy quilt and began pulling. He dragged the bundle down the hallway, out the door, into the oppressive heat of the Georgia night. As he heaved the weight toward the driveway, the quilt snagged. He adjusted his grip. In the frantic, clumsy motion, the friction pulled at his right hand. The latex glove slipped from his sweaty skin. It fell away, landing softly on the bed of dry pine needles near the manicured front lawn. He didn't notice. He loaded the body into the vehicle. The metal doors slammed shut, a dull thud echoing into the empty street. Ryan got behind the wheel. His mind immediately jumped to the only person he knew who had the resources, the geographical knowledge, and the complete lack of moral boundaries required to make this disappear. He pointed the vehicle away from the city limits. He drove straight toward the deep, sprawling isolation of the Hudson Pecan Orchard. October 24th, 2005. Monday morning at Irwin County High School began with rigid predictability. The 8 a.m. bell echoed through the cinderblock hallways. Lockers slammed shut. Students filed into their assigned seats. But room 612 remained entirely empty. No lights, no lesson plans on the chalkboard. For any other educator, a delayed arrival might prompt a casual phone call to the front office. For the 11th grade history teacher, an unexcused absence was a massive, immediate red flag. She had never missed a single day without meticulous prior coordination. By 8:30 a.m., minor administrative annoyance shifted into genuine, rising concern. Faculty members attempted to reach her mobile device. The calls routed straight to voicemail. By 8:50 a.m., local law enforcement was dispatched to West Park Street to conduct a standard welfare check. The arriving patrol officers found the property locked in a state of eerie, sterile preservation. The pearl-white Mitsubishi Eclipse sat angled in the driveway. The engine block was entirely cold to the touch. Oddly, the vehicle was unlocked. A crisp $100 bill rested plainly visible in the center console. There were thick streaks of red Georgia clay clinging to the tires, a distinct, glaring contrast to the paved residential roads of her usual weekend route. Officers knocked heavily on the front door. The only response was the frantic, isolated barking of the German Shepherd mix inside. Protocol was bypassed. The officers circumvented the deadbolts and breached the residence. The interior atmosphere was jarringly cold. The central air conditioning was running at maximum capacity, fighting the heavy morning humidity seeping through the window panes. Nothing appeared visibly ransacked. The hardwood floors were clean. The living room furniture was perfectly aligned. Her mobile phone was plugged into the wall, actively drawing a charge on the bedroom nightstand. A single set of clothes, the casual wear she likely wore the previous day, was draped neatly over a chair. Her beloved dog paced nervously, highly distressed by the isolation. But crucial, everyday items were completely missing. Her purse, her vehicle keys, the house keys. The environment presented a massive logical contradiction. The locked doors and the charging phone suggested a resident who had settled in for the quiet night. The missing purse and keys indicated someone who had left intentionally. Yet her car was still sitting in the driveway. A highly visible local figure walking out into the heavy darkness of rural Georgia on foot, leaving behind her transportation and her communication device, defied every established pattern of her heavily documented existence. Crime scene technicians from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation soon arrived to replace the local patrolman. The property transitioned instantly from a private sanctuary into a forensic grid. Technicians dusted the doorframes for latent prints. They processed the scene with intense scrutiny, securing the perimeter with yellow tape. The dog was handed over to a neighbor. News of the empty house spread through the 3-square-mile town with the speed of a lit fuse. Within hours, the localized concern mutated into a massive, county-wide mobilization. This was not a fractured community waiting passively for federal intervention. Ocilla possessed a deep, agrarian self-reliance. By Tuesday morning, an ad hoc command center was erected in the town center. Hundreds of civilian volunteers abandoned their shifts at the local agricultural processing plants and farming supply stores to join the organized grid searches. The geographical reality of Irwin County presents a logistical nightmare for a tactical recovery operation. The terrain is a vast, suffocating expanse of dense pine forests, sprawling agricultural fields, and deep, stagnant swamp water. The heat index pushed past 85 degrees Fahrenheit, baking the search grids and exhausting the volunteers. The air was thick with the smell of diesel exhaust from portable generators and the relentless hum of insects. Men on horseback rode through the impenetrable brush. ATVs carved muddy paths through the thick undergrowth. Civilian helicopters and low-flying crop dusters scoured the county from the air, looking for disturbed earth, vulture activity, or discarded clothing. Local hunters, intimately familiar with the backwoods topography, led trained tracking dogs through miles of wet ravines. The search lines moved shoulder to shoulder, rhythmically beating the tall, dry grass with heavy walking sticks. They dragged the dark waters of the Yalapaha River. They systematically drained isolated agricultural ponds. They inspected hundreds of abandoned barns, rusted grain silos, and decaying hunting blinds scattered across the rural landscape. Despite the unprecedented volume of human capital deployed, the physical yield was absolutely zero. No purse, no keys, no torn fabric. The environment had simply swallowed her whole. As the first week bled into the second, the adrenaline of the initial search faded into a heavy, creeping paranoia. The psychological echo of the disappearance fundamentally altered the social fabric of Ocilla. The absolute lack of a forced entry or a bloody crime scene meant the threat was entirely formless. It meant the perpetrator was likely someone operating within their own borders, someone who knew the town, someone who knew her. Residents who had never locked their doors in decades suddenly drove to the hardware store to purchase heavy deadbolts and exterior floodlights. The hardware aisles were systematically emptied of ammunition. Trust evaporated completely. Every passing pickup truck was scrutinized. Every neighbor with a fresh scratch on their arm or a slightly inconsistent timeline was subjected to quiet, vicious rumors at the local diner. The community had successfully scoured hundreds of miles of unforgiving terrain. They had printed tens of thousands of flyers. They had raised a massive financial reward through local donations. Yet, they were essentially fighting a ghost. The ambitious history teacher had vanished from a secure house, leaving behind a desperately searching town and an official investigation that was about to hit a massive, decade-long wall. The only physical anchor the authorities possessed was the sterile latex glove discarded in the front yard. Crime lab technicians successfully extracted a male DNA profile from the inside of the rubber material. This should have been the key to an immediate resolution. However, when the genetic sequence was run through the National CODIS database, the system returned 0 matches. The perpetrator was a ghost. Desperate, agents began systematically swabbing the cheeks of dozens of local men, demanding DNA samples from anyone who had ever interacted with the victim. This analytical sweep rapidly produced 2 highly visible red herrings. The first was a former romantic partner. He was a local law enforcement officer who had recently returned from a military deployment overseas. Their relationship had been long-term but highly volatile, officially severing mere months before the incident. The friction of their breakup was heavily documented. Consequently, he became the immediate target for public suspicion. Investigators interrogated him repeatedly, searching for any microscopic fracture in his narrative. He maintained absolute innocence, providing a rigid alibi that placed him miles away, surrounded by verified witnesses, during the critical window of the abduction. Despite the heavy cloud of local rumor, forensic analysis of his vehicle yielded 0 physical ties. His DNA did not match the glove. The second shadow fell on a married police officer from a neighboring jurisdiction. Phone records indicated a high volume of communication between him and the history teacher, including calls placed on the very Sunday she went missing. He ultimately admitted to leaving a business card tightly wedged in her front door that weekend. This revelation threatened to permanently fracture his personal life. The GBI pressed him hard, operating under the theory that a hidden, illicit romance might have escalated into sudden violence. However, his alibi proved completely impenetrable. He had simply been attempting to check on her welfare after she missed a social engagement. His DNA was also a negative match. These intensely focused avenues of inquiry ultimately resulted in total dead ends. The investigators were chasing phantoms through the Georgia clay. Years began to bleed into a full decade. The massive financial reward fund sat completely untouched. The missing posters taped to the windows of the local hardware store faded under the punishing southern sun. The case file ballooned, becoming the largest in the entire history of the state's investigative bureau. It contained thousands of interviews and completely empty leads. Ocilla learned to live with the permanent trauma. The empty house on West Park Street was eventually sold. The community stopped conducting grid searches and accepted the suffocating mystery. The total stagnation held firm until late 2016. At this juncture, the digital era forced a massive, uninvited spotlight back onto the 3-square-mile town. Independent media, specifically a highly produced, serialized audio documentary, arrived in Irwin County. The creator began knocking on doors, re-interviewing old witnesses, and broadcasting the town's darkest secret to a global audience of millions. The pressure generated by this renewed scrutiny was immense. The local authorities were forced to establish a dedicated tip line. The intense public pressure acted as a massive psychological catalyst. The sheer volume of attention began to crack the rigid silence of the local underworld. The breakthrough was not born from a brilliant forensic maneuver. It was born from a failure of nerve. In early 2017, The GBI received a tip that radically altered the entire trajectory of the 12-year investigation. A young woman stepped forward, carrying a massive psychological burden. She informed the authorities that her current romantic partner, the volatile pecan orchard heir, Bo Dukes, had confessed a horrific secret to her. According to her statement, Bo had told her that back in 2005, his former high school associate, Ryan Duke, had broken into the teacher's home to steal money for narcotics. The burglary went violently wrong. Ryan had strangled the homeowner, loaded her into his vehicle, and driven her to the isolated property owned by Bo's family. The informant stated that Bo had been enlisted not to commit the murder, but to completely destroy the evidence. For the investigators, the names were jarring. Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes had never been on the primary radar. They were peripheral figures, entirely disconnected from the victim's ambitious social circle. Crucially, because Ryan had never been arrested for a felony, his DNA had never entered the national database to trigger a match with the glove. The GBI moved with immediate, lethal precision. The 12-year grace period was over. Agents located Ryan and brought him into the interrogation room. The man who sat across the table was a hollow shell, physically and mentally degraded by years of severe substance abuse. He did not possess the psychological fortitude to maintain a decade-old lie. Under the focused pressure of the interrogation, the facade crumbled almost instantly. He confessed. He detailed the desperate need for drug money, the impromptu decision to target the dark house, the chaotic struggle, and the terrifying realization of what he had done. He confirmed the location of the disposal. Most importantly, he admitted that the sterile latex glove found in the front yard belonged to him. It had slipped from his sweating hand in a blind panic as he dragged the heavy quilt across the lawn. A simple cheek swab finally provided the exact DNA match the GBI had sought for over 4,000 days. The focus then shifted aggressively to Bo Dukes. While Ryan had committed the initial violence, Bo was the architect of the absolute erasure. Ryan confessed that they had taken the body deep into the Hudson pecan orchard. There, they had built a massive fire. They maintained the blaze for days, completely incinerating the remains until absolutely nothing recognizable was left in the ash. The decade of frustration shattered in a matter of hours. The untouchable phantoms were gone, replaced by two deeply flawed men who had hidden in plain sight, carrying the weight of a horrific secret while the entire town tore itself apart looking for answers. The swift arrests permanently fractured the men's toxic codependency. Inside the courthouse, their unified front collapsed into a bitter, high-stakes game of mutual betrayal. Bo Dukes faced a jury first in 2019. The state did not pursue him for the initial violence, but rather the calculated destruction of a human being. The prosecution detailed how he utilized his family's isolated property to orchestrate a fire so intense it reduced the victim to microscopic bone fragments. The jury convicted him on all counts, yielding a 25-year prison sentence. 3 years later, the primary aggressor finally stood trial. By 2022, his narrative had completely inverted. He testified under oath that his initial confession was entirely fabricated under the crushing weight of drug withdrawal and fear. He attempted to hurl the entirety of the murder charge onto his incarcerated former friend, claiming his only role was moving the body after the fact. The jury's verdict reflected the convoluted reality of the decayed evidence. They acquitted him of malice murder, finding him guilty only of concealing a death. He received a maximum 10-year sentence, a staggering, hollow conclusion for a town that had waited 17 years for absolute justice. The local community eventually returned to its quiet daily rhythms, but the fundamental trust that once defined the area never fully recovered. The sprawling agricultural land where the destruction occurred still stands just outside the borders, silent and imposing. In the heavy heat of the southern summer, the long, uniform rows of trees cast deep shadows across the sandy dirt. They serve as a permanent, living monument to a profound fracture. A brilliant mentor driven by relentless ambition was systematically erased in the dark, leaving an entire county forever altered by a horrific truth that had been hiding in plain sight for over 4,000 days. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.